secret was the women. For centuries, for the millennia of the Imperium's institutional history, during which the Bene Tleilaxu operated as the civilization's most secretive faction, the secret the faction maintained behind the institutional concealment the secrecy's sustained operation provided was the secret about what the axolotl tanks were. The tanks were described as biological production facilities. The tanks were described as the technology through which the Tleilaxu's most valued products, the gholas, the face dancers, the biological solutions the Imperium's institutional demands required, were manufactured. The tanks were described in the language the technology's description would have employed, were referenced as the equipment the production utilized, as the systems the manufacturing operated through, as the facilities the biological engineering encompassed. The tanks were women. The axolotl tanks were Tleilaxu women, women whose bodies were used as the biological factories the production required, whose autonomy was eliminated, whose consciousness was reduced to the level the production function's biological operation demanded. The women were the tanks. The tanks were the women. The equation was the secret, was the fact that Tleilaxu's institutional secrecy concealed behind the centuries of the concealment's sustained maintenance. The revelation was one of the saga's most disturbing moments. The exposure of the secret, the documentation of what the axolotl tanks actually were, was the moment that converted the Tleilaxu from the mysterious biological engineers the secrecy's maintenance had presented to the moral horror the revelation's content constituted. The revelation changed the assessment. The mystery became the atrocity. The technology became the exploitation. The production became the violation. This is the story of the Bene Tleilaxu, the story of the faction whose institutional character was defined by the secret the faction maintained, the secret about how the faction's products were produced, the secret about what the production's biological mechanisms actually were, the secret whose content was the moral violation the concealment was designed to prevent the external assessment of. The story is not comfortable. The Tleilaxu were not comfortable. The faction whose institutional operations included the exploitation the secret concealed was the faction whose story the discomfort the exploitation generated had to encompass. The story requires the sustained attention to the exploitation's character, requires the examination of what the exploitation constituted, what the exploitation produced, and what the exploitation revealed about the faction whose institutional operations the exploitation encompassed. The Bene Tleilaxu were the Imperium's genetic manipulators. The faction's institutional identity, the position the faction occupied in the Imperium's institutional landscape, was the identity of the biological engineering's practitioners. The Tleilaxu developed the biological capabilities, the genetic engineering, the cloning, the biological production that the Imperium's institutional demands required, and that the Imperium's other institutional actors could not provide. The capabilities were valued. The Imperium's institutional actors, the noble houses, the governance's administrative apparatus, the intelligence operations the political landscape's competitive dynamics generated, valued the Tleilaxu's biological capabilities for the products the capabilities provided. The gholas served the institutional purposes the resurrection technology's availability made possible. The face dancers served the intelligence purposes the shape-shifting capabilities deployment encompassed. The biological solutions served the institutional needs the conventional approaches could not address. The valuation was the Tleilaxu's institutional position's foundation. The faction whose capabilities the institutional actors valued was the faction whose institutional position the valuation sustained. the faction whose presence in the institutional landscape the capabilities value justified, the faction whose operations the capabilities demand maintained. The valuation coexisted with the distrust. The institutional actors who valued the Tleilaxu's capabilities distrusted the Tleilaxu's institutional character, assessed the faction's secrecy as the concealment the distrust warranted, evaluated the faction's closed culture as the opacity the suspicion justified. The valuation and the distrust were simultaneous, were both present in the institutional actors' assessment of the faction's institutional position. The simultaneity was the Tleilaxu's institutional condition. The faction was valued and distrusted. The products were purchased and the producers were suspected. The capabilities were deployed and the deployers were monitored. The condition was the faction's sustained experience in the institutional landscape, the ongoing combination of the acceptance and the wariness the faction's institutional position encompassed. The Tleilaxu's homeworld was the closed world. The planet, maintained behind the institutional barriers the faction's secrecy required, was the world the external observers could not penetrate with the observation the other world's institutional transparency permitted. The homeworld was sealed, was protected by the secrecy's institutional mechanisms from the external access the observation would have provided. The sealing was comprehensive. The Tleilaxu maintained the homeworld's concealment through the mechanisms the institutional secrecy encompassed, through the restricted access, the controlled communication, the managed interaction the secrecy's sustained maintenance required. The mechanisms were effective, sustained the concealment across the centuries of the secrecy's operation, maintained the homeworld's opacity across the decades and the generations the concealment's duration encompassed. The concealment's effectiveness was the Tleilaxu's most consequential institutional achievement alongside the biological capabilities the concealment protected. The faction that maintained the concealment, that sustained the secrecy's mechanisms across the centuries the concealment's operation encompassed, was the faction whose institutional capability the concealment's sustained effectiveness demonstrated. The capability was institutional rather than technological. The concealment was not maintained through the technology, was not sustained by the engineering the technological concealment would have required. The concealment was maintained through the institution, was sustained by the organizational practices, the cultural norms, the behavioral controls the institutional management, the concealment's maintenance demanded. The institutional maintenance was comprehensive. Every dimension of the Tleilaxu's interaction with the external world, every communication, every commercial exchange, every diplomatic engagement the faction's institutional operations encompassed, was managed through the concealment's requirements. The management was sustained, was maintained across every interaction the faction's external engagement generated, was applied to every dimension the interaction's concealment-related implications encompassed. The sustained management was the concealment's most consequential quality. The concealment that was maintained through the sustained management of every external interaction was the concealment whose comprehensiveness exceeded what the occasional management's intermittent application could have produced. The comprehensiveness was the quality that made the concealment effective across the centuries the concealment's operation encompassed. The Tleilaxu's religious dimension was the dimension that connected the faction's institutional secrecy to the faction's cultural identity, the religious tradition that provided the theological framework the secrecy's institutional practices were conducted within. The Tleilaxu maintained a religious tradition. The tradition, distinct from the Orange Catholic Bible's ecumenical framework the Imperium's broader religious landscape encompassed, was the tradition that provided the cultural context the faction's institutional operations were conducted within. The tradition was the identity, was the cultural element that defined the faction's self-understanding alongside the biological capabilities the institutional landscape identified the faction through. The tradition included the theological justification. The religious framework the tradition sustained included the theological arguments the exploitation's justification required. The arguments that the axolotl tank's use of the women's bodies was the practice the theological tradition authorized. The arguments that the exploitation's moral character was the character the religious framework's authority sanctioned. The justification was institutional. The theological arguments that justified the exploitation were the arguments the institution maintained, were the positions the religious tradition's institutional authority sustained, were the claims the faction's cultural framework's theological dimension provided. The justification was not the individual's moral assessment. The justification was the institution's theological position, was the framework's authorized interpretation of the practice's moral character. The institutional justification's relationship with the practice's moral character was the relationship the saga's moral argument examined, the relationship between the institution's authorized interpretation and the practice's assessed character that the interpretation's authority did not necessarily determine. The institution said, the practice is justified. The moral assessment said, the practice is exploitation. The institution's authorization and the moral assessment's conclusion were in conflict. The conflict was the saga's moral examination, the examination of whether the institutional authorization determined the practice's moral character or whether the moral character was determined by the assessment the authorization's authority could not override. The examination's conclusion was the saga's verdict. The examination concluded that the institutional authorization did not determine the practice's moral character, that the exploitation was the exploitation regardless of the theological framework's authorization, that the women's body's use as the manufacturing equipment was the moral violation regardless of the religious tradition's sanction. The verdict was not stated. The verdict was demonstrated, was shown through the narrative's treatment of the revelation's response, through the characters' reactions to the secret's exposure, through the institutional landscape's assessment of the practice the exposure revealed. The demonstration was the verdict. The reactions were the assessment. The assessment was the conclusion. The ghola technology was the Tleilaxu's most valued product, the biological capability whose institutional significance exceeded the other capabilities the faction's biological engineering encompassed. The ghola was the biological resurrection. The technology, the production of the biological replica from the deceased person's cells, was the technology that produced the body the deceased person had inhabited in the form the biological replication could generate. The production was biological, was conducted through the biological mechanisms the axolotl tank's operation encompassed, was generated through the biological processes the tank's biological functioning sustained. The ghola carried the original's genetics. The biological replica the technology produced was the replica whose genetics matched the original person's genetics, whose biological configuration replicated the original's biological configuration through the cellular material the replication was conducted from. The genetics were the original's. The body was the original's replica. The replication was the technology's product. The ghola did not carry the original's memories. The biological replica whose genetics matched the original's genetics did not carry the memories the original's consciousness had accumulated, did not possess the experiential content the original's life had generated, did not maintain the identity the original's consciousness had sustained. The ghola was the body, without the person. The body was present. The person was absent. The presence and the absence coexisted in the same organism the technology produced. The coexistence was the ghola's most consequential quality. The body that was the original's replica, without the original's identity, was the organism whose character the body, without the person, quality constituted. The quality was the technology's product, was generated by the replication's biological comprehensiveness alongside the identity's experiential incompleteness. The identity's recovery was the technology's most consequential potential capability. The biological memory, the informational substrate the original cells preserved alongside the genetic configuration the replication encompassed, contained the potential for the original identity's reconstruction. The potential was dormant, was present in the biological substrate. Without the potential's activation, the dormancy's condition sustained. The activation required the emotional crisis. The identity's recovery, the reconstruction of the original person's identity from the biological substrate the dormancy contained, was triggered by the emotional conditions the crisis generated. The conditions were not specified in advance, were not the predetermined triggers the engineering could produce through the design the activation's requirements specified. The conditions were emergent, were generated by the circumstances the ghola's existence encountered, were produced by the emotional dynamics the circumstances' intensity created. Duncan Idaho's ghola recovery was the technology's most documented activation. The hate ghola, the biological replica of the Atreides swordmaster the Tleilaxu had produced for the Dune Messiah conspiracy's purposes, experienced the identity recovery during the emotional crisis the conspiracy's events produced. The recovery was triggered by the crisis's emotional intensity, by the convergence of the events the crisis encompassed, by the emotional conditions the convergence generated. The recovery's documentation was the technology's validation. The ghola technology could produce the body. The body could recover the identity. The recovery was possible, was demonstrated through the documented activation the crisis's emotional conditions generated. The validation was consequential, demonstrated that the biological replication's product was not limited to the body without the identity, that the identity could be recovered from the biological substrate the replication's product contained. The face dancers were the Tleilaxu's most politically consequential product, the biological constructs whose shape-shifting capability the political landscape's intelligence operations exploited for the purposes the capability served. The face dancers were shapeshifters. The biological constructs produced through the axolotl tanks biological mechanisms alongside the gholas the tanks produced possessed the capability for the physical appearance's alteration. The alteration was comprehensive, encompassed the facial features, the body's presentation, the physical characteristics the appearance's recognition depended on. The capability was the intelligence tool. The face dancers, whose shape-shifting the political landscape's intelligence operations deployed, were the tools the operations utilized for the infiltration the capability's deployment encompassed. The infiltration was covert, was conducted behind the appearance the shape-shifting generated, was maintained without the detection the appearance's disguise prevented. The face dancer's capabilities evolved across the saga's documented timeline. The early face dancers, the constructs the saga's early documentation encompassed, were limited in the capability's scope. The limitations included the detectability. The Bene Gesserit's trained perception could detect the face dancer's altered appearance. The Sisterhood's observational capabilities could identify the disguise the shape-shifting produced. The later face dancers exceeded the early limitations. The constructs the saga's later documentation encompassed, the face dancers, the heretics, and the chapter house periods included, were the constructs whose capabilities exceeded the earlier version's limitations. The later face dancers were harder to detect, approached the comprehensive replication the earlier version's limitations had prevented, approximated the original person's appearance with the fidelity the detection's difficulty required. The evolution was the Tleilaxu's sustained institutional investment. The improvement the later face dancers demonstrated, the enhanced capability the later versions exhibited, was the product of the sustained engineering investment that Tleilaxu's institutional operations had applied to the technology across the generations the investment encompassed. The investment demonstrated the Tleilaxu's institutional commitment to the biological development the faction's institutional identity was organized around. The faction whose institutional position depended on the biological capabilities the institutional landscape valued was the faction whose sustained investment in the capabilities improvement the institutional position's maintenance required. The later face dancers' enhanced capabilities raised the detection challenge the Imperium's institutional actors had to address. The constructs whose capabilities exceeded the earlier version's detectability were the constructs whose infiltration the institutional actors' defensive measures could not reliably prevent. The defense's inability was the face dancers' most consequential later period quality, the quality that made the later face dancers the intelligence threat the institutional landscape's defensive capabilities could not confidently contain. The threat was consequential. The face dancers whose infiltration could not be reliably detected were the face dancers whose deployment the institutional landscape could not reliably prevent. The non-prevention was the threat, was the condition under which the institutional actors' operations were conducted with the awareness that the face dancers' infiltration might be present without the detection the awareness's resolution required. The awareness without the resolution was the institutional landscape's later period condition in the face dancers' dimension. The actors knew the face dancers might be present. The actors could not confirm the presence or the absence. The non-confirmation sustained the awareness. The sustained awareness was the threat's psychological dimension, the condition of the institutional uncertainty the face dancers' enhanced capabilities produced. The Tleilaxu's role across the saga's documented timeline was the role of the faction whose biological capabilities intersected with every era's political dynamics, the sustained institutional presence whose products and whose operations connected the faction to the events each era produced. In the era before the saga's primary events, the Tleilaxu operated in the institutional landscape's margins. The faction's position, maintained through the biological capabilities' valued provision alongside the institutional secrecy's sustained concealment, was the position of the peripheral actor whose products were consumed by the central actors the institutional landscape encompassed. The consumption was commercial, was conducted through the transactions the institutional demand for the biological products generated was maintained through the commercial relationships the demand satisfaction sustained. The marginality was deliberate. The Tleilaxu's institutional culture maintained the marginal position, sustained the peripheral presence through the deliberate avoidance of the central position the institutional landscape's competitive dynamics occupied. The avoidance was the secrecy's institutional requirement, the maintenance of the distance from the central dynamics scrutiny the concealment's preservation demanded. The deliberate marginality was the faction's strategic position. The margins provided the concealment the centre would not have accommodated. The margins provide the operational freedom the center's monitoring would have restricted. The margins provided the institutional autonomy the center's engagement would have compromised. In the Dune Messiah period, the Tleilaxu moved from the margins toward the center. The conspiracy against Paul's governance, the institutional coordination the Bene Tleilaxu participated in alongside the Spacing Guild and Irulan, was the engagement that brought the faction closer to the political landscape's central dynamics than the faction's marginal positioning had previously permitted. The Tleilaxu's contribution to the conspiracy was the ghola, the hate ghola, the biological resurrection of Duncan Idaho produced through the axolotl tank's mechanisms, was the conspiracy's emotional weapon. The weapon was designed for Paul's personal vulnerability, was directed at the person inside the prescient consciousness rather than at the consciousness's political operation. The gholas production was the Tleilaxu's institutional capability deployed for the conspiracy's purposes, the capability that could produce the biological replica of the deceased person, that could manufacture the body the deceased had inhabited from the cellular material the deceased's remains provided, was the capability the conspiracy's design exploited for the emotional weapon the design specified. The deployment was consequential. The gholas' presence in Paul's domestic sphere, the dead friend's body moving through the governance's personal space, produced the emotional effects the conspiracy's design anticipated. The effects were the weapon's operation, the emotional erosion the dead friend's resurrected body's presence generated in the consciousness the weapon was directed against. The deployment was also the Tleilaxu's institutional interests expression. The faction participated in the conspiracy because the faction's institutional assessment concluded that the conspiracy's success served the faction's institutional purposes, served the institutional autonomy the faction's operational freedom depended on, addressed the governance's comprehensive authority the faction's marginal positioning was threatened by. The conspiracy failed. The revolution that Paul's governance had already accomplished, the political transformation the Fremen's military victory had already produced, was the transformation the conspiracy could not reverse. The conspiracy's failure was the failure of the institutional coordination the conspiracy constituted, the inability of the coordinated action the Bene Tleilaxu, the Guild, and Irulan had combined to produce to overcome the governance the coordination was directed against. The failure did not eliminate the Tleilaxu. The faction survived the conspiracy's failure, maintained the institutional presence the biological capabilities' continued value sustained, preserved the operational position the institutional landscape's ongoing demand for the biological products provided. The survival was the capability's product. The faction that could produce the gholas, the face dancers, the biological solutions the institutional landscape demanded was the faction whose institutional survival the demand sustained regardless of the conspiracy's outcome. The demand persisted. The capabilities persisted. The faction persisted. The Duncan Idaho ghola lineage was the Tleilaxu's most sustained product. The series of biological resurrections the faction produced across the millennia the saga documented. The lineage began with hate. The first Duncan Idaho ghola, produced for the Dune Messiah conspiracy's purposes, deployed as the emotional weapon the conspiracy's design specified, was the lineage's initiating instance, the hate gholas' identity recovery. The activation of the original Duncan Idaho's personality from the biological substrate the dormancy contained was the lineage's initiating recovery. The lineage continued through the God Emperor's era. Leto II maintained the Duncan Idaho gholas, ordered the successive resurrections the lineage's continuation required. maintained the biological replicas across the 3,500-year governance the God Emperor's transformation sustained. The successive resurrections were the God Emperor's institutional demand. Leto required the Duncan Idaho gholas, required the presence of the original Swordmaster's biological replica in the governance's operational and personal dimensions. The requirement was sustained, was maintained across the millennia the governance encompassed, was fulfilled through the successive resurrections the Tleilaxu produced. The requirement's motivation was complex. The God Emperor's demand for the Duncan Idaho gholas was the demand whose motivations encompassed the personal and the institutional simultaneously. The personal motivation was the attachment, the connection to the original Duncan Idaho the pre-transformation consciousness had maintained. The relationship with the Atreides retainer the consciousness's formation had included. The institutional motivation was the testing. The God Emperor used the Duncan Idaho gholas as the test, as the biological replicas whose responses to the governance's conditions the testing encompassed, whose reactions to the governance's provisions the assessment evaluated. The testing was the governance's experimental dimension, the sustained assessment of how the Duncan Idaho consciousness responded to the conditions each successive ghola encountered. The testing produced the data. Each successive gholas responses, each resurrection's consciousness's engagement with the governance's conditions, produced the information the testing's assessment encompassed. The information accumulated was collected across the successive resurrections the lineage's continuation provided, was assessed across the gholas the testing encompassed. The lineage's continuation across the millennia was the Tleilaxu's most sustained commercial relationship. The faction that produced the successive Duncan Idaho gholas for the God Emperor's ongoing demand was the faction whose commercial relationship with the governance the demand sustained across the centuries, and the millennia the demand's continuation encompassed. The relationship was consequential for both parties. The Tleilaxu received the commercial compensation the production's sustained operation generated. The God Emperor received the gholas the demand specified. The exchange was the relationship's content, the ongoing transaction the demand and the supply constituted across the duration the relationship's maintenance encompassed. The lineage's most consequential instance was the final Duncan Idaho ghola the saga documented, the ghola whose consciousness operated in the Heretics and the Chapter House periods. The final documented ghola was the ghola whose capabilities exceeded the previous instance's capabilities, whose consciousness's development included the dimensions the previous gholas' developments had not encompassed. The exceeded capabilities included the immunity. The final documented Duncan Idaho ghola demonstrated the prescience immunity, the characteristic the consciousness possessed that rendered the consciousness invisible to the prescient perception the other consciousness's awareness encompassed. The immunity was the Siona genetics product, was the capability the breeding program's genetic management had developed in the bloodline the immunity's presence encompassed. The immunity's presence in the Duncan Idaho ghola was the lineage's most consequential genetic development, the development that connected the ghola technology's biological replication to the breeding program's genetic management through the immunity's presence in the consciousness the replication produced. The Tleilaxu masters were the faction's leadership, the persons whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed and whose decisions the faction's operations were directed by. The masters were the faction's most concealed persons. The institutional secrecy that maintained the faction's homeworlds opacity maintained the master's personal concealment alongside the homeworld's institutional concealment. The masters were hidden, were maintained behind the secrecy's institutional barriers alongside the homeworld's conditions the barriers protected. The master's concealment was the leadership's protection. The persons whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed, whose decisions directed the operations the governance administered, were the persons whose protection the concealment provided from the institutional landscape's competitive dynamics, potentially destructive attention. The protection was consequential. The masters who were concealed were the masters who could not be targeted, could not be subjected to the assassination the competitive dynamics war of assassins might have directed against the faction's leadership, could not be addressed by the intelligence operations the competitive dynamics information warfare might have deployed against the leadership's concealment. The master's religious role was the leadership's cultural dimension. The masters occupied the positions the religious tradition's institutional hierarchy encompassed, held the authority the theological framework's institutional structure provided alongside the governance's political authority the institutional operations management encompassed. The dual authority, the religious and the political, was the leadership's institutional character. The masters governed through the religious authority alongside the political authority, through the theological framework's institutional mandate alongside the governance's administrative mandate. The dual governance was the faction's institutional character expressed in the leadership's operational mode, the expression of the faction's religious political integration in the leadership's dual authorities exercise. The master's most documented individual was Scytale, the Tleilaxu master whose presence in the saga's narrative was the most sustained, whose operational activities the documentation encompassed across the periods the documentation addressed, was the master whose institutional position the narrative rendered with the sustained attention the position's significance required. Scytale operated as the faction's representative, the master whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed was the representative whose engagement with the institutional landscape's other actors constituted the faction's external interaction. The representation was consequential, was the mechanism through which the faction's institutional interests were pursued in the landscape's dynamics, was the engagement through which the faction's operational purposes were deployed in the landscape's interactions. Scytale's participation in the Dune Messiah conspiracy was the representation's most documented engagement. The master whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed participated in the conspiracy as the faction's representative, engaged with the conspiracy's institutional coordination as the faction's authorized participant. The participation was consequential. Scytale's engagement with the conspiracy, the operational activities the participation encompassed, alongside the gholas provision the conspiracy required, was the engagement that brought the faction's institutional interests into the conspiracy's coordinated operations. Scytale's survival across the saga's documented timeline, the master's continued presence in the later novels the documentation encompassed, was the leadership's institutional continuity expressed in the individual's sustained presence. The master who survived across the periods the documentation addressed was the leader whose institutional continuity the survival expressed. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the Bene Gesserit was the relationship between the two factions whose biological capabilities the Imperium's institutional landscape included. The relationship between the genetic manipulators and the biological cultivators whose institutional traditions differing approaches to the biological development the relationship encompassed. The relationship was adversarial. The two factions whose biological capabilities the institutional landscape valued were the two factions whose institutional interests, the capabilities' overlapping domains, generated the competition the adversarial character constituted. The competition was the relationship's quality, was the sustained institutional rivalry the overlapping capabilities produced. The adversarial character reflected the institutional tradition's differing approaches. The Tleilaxu's approach was engineering, was the manipulation of the biological systems through the technological intervention the engineering constituted. The Bene Gesserit's approach was cultivation, was the development of the biological capabilities through the training and the institutional management the cultivation constituted. The engineering and the cultivation were different methods. The engineering intervened, applied the technological modification to the biological system through the engineering's mechanisms. The cultivation developed, drew the capability from the biological system through the training's sustained practice. The intervening and the developing were different activities, produced different products through different mechanisms applied to different aspects of the biological capability. The product's overlap was the competition's source. The engineering's products and the cultivation's products served some of the same institutional functions, provided the biological capabilities the institutional landscape's demands encompassed through the different methods the respective traditions employed. The overlap generated the competition. The competition sustained the adversarial relationship. The adversarial relationship included the mutual assessment. Each faction assessed the other, evaluated the other's capabilities, monitored the other's operations, identified the other's vulnerabilities through the intelligence the assessment's sustained operation generated. The Bene Gesserit assessed the Tleilaxu with the distrust the sisterhood's institutional assessment generated. The sisterhood's evaluation of the Tleilaxu, informed by the intelligence the sisterhood's network provided, shaped by the institutional rivalry the overlapping capabilities sustained, was the evaluation whose distrust reflected the assessment's conclusions about the faction's institutional character. The distrust was deepened by the secrecy. The Tleilaxu's institutional concealment, the opacity the faction maintained around the homeworlds conditions and the production's mechanisms, was the concealment the sisterhood's assessment identified as the indicator the concealment's content warranted the distrust the concealment generated. The deepened distrust was the relationship's sustained condition. The sisterhood's ongoing distrust of the Tleilaxu, maintained across the periods the relationship's institutional history encompassed, was the condition the secrecy's sustained opacity sustained. The opacity generated the distrust. The distrust informed the assessment. The assessment sustained the adversarial relationship. The relationship was also interactive. The adversarial factions interacted, engaged with each other's operations through the institutional landscape's dynamics the engagement encompassed. The interactions included the commercial, the transactions the biological products exchange generated. The interactions included the political, the engagements the institutional landscape's competitive dynamics produced. The interactions included the intelligence, the monitoring the mutual assessment's sustained operation encompassed. The interactions were conducted within the adversarial relationship's conditions, were managed through the distrust the relationship sustained, were calibrated to the competition the relationship constituted. The management was sustained, was maintained across the interactions the relationship's operational history encompassed. The moral argument about the axolotl tanks was the argument the saga sustained through the revelation's consequences, the argument about the relationship between the institutional purpose and the moral character of the methods the purpose's pursuit employed. The argument said, the purpose does not justify the method. The institutional purpose the Tleilaxu's biological production served, the provision of the gholas, the face dancers, the biological solutions the institutional landscape demanded, was the purpose whose institutional value the demand's sustained presence demonstrated. The method the purpose's pursuit employed, the use of women's bodies as the manufacturing equipment the production required, was the method whose moral character the institutional purpose's value could not redeem. The non-redemption was the argument's core. The argument examined the relationship between the purpose's value and the method's moral character, and concluded that the relationship was not the redemptive relationship the institutional justification required, that the purpose's value did not convert the method's moral violation into the morally acceptable practice the institutional authorization's theological framework claimed. The conclusion was demonstrated through the narrative's treatment. The characters who encountered the revelation, who learned what the axolotl tanks actually were, responded with the reactions the revelation's moral content produced. The reactions were horror. The reactions were revulsion. The reactions were the moral assessment the revelation's content generated in the consciousnesses the revelation was presented to. The reactions were the argument's evidence. The consciousnesses that assessed the revelation's content produced the moral conclusions the content warranted, concluded that the women's use as the manufacturing equipment was the moral violation the institutional authorization could not justify. The conclusions were the evidence. The data the argument's demonstration generated through the character's moral assessments. The argument extended beyond the Tleilaxu to the civilization. The argument said, the civilization that consumed the products the moral violation produced was the civilization that participated in the violation through the consumption. The institutional actors who purchased the gholas, who deployed the face dancers, who utilized the biological solutions the axolotl tanks produced, were the actors whose consumption sustained the production the consumption depended on. The consumption's participation was the argument's civilizational dimension. The argument that examined the Tleilaxu's production methods also examined the civilization's consumption practices, also assessed the institutional actor's relationship with the production the actor's consumption sustained. The assessment concluded the consumers participated. The participation was the consumption's moral consequence. The consequence was the civilization's moral complicity in the production the consumption maintained. The complicity was not acknowledged. The institutional actors who consumed the Tleilaxu's products did not acknowledge the consumption's moral implications, did not recognize the complicity the consumption constituted, did not assess the participation the consumption's sustained maintenance produced. The non-acknowledgement was the distance's product was generated by the institutional separation between the consumption and the production the supply chain's commercial mechanisms maintained. The distance was the complicity's concealment. The commercial mechanisms that connected the production to the consumption, the transactions, the distribution. The institutional relationships the commerce encompassed were the mechanisms that maintained the distance the complicity's non-acknowledgement depended on. The distance concealed the production's methods from the consumption's awareness. The concealment sustained the non-acknowledgement. The non-acknowledgement permitted the consumption's continuation. The continuation was the moral argument's final dimension. The consumption continued. The production continued. The exploitation continued. The moral violation continued. The continuation was sustained by the distance the commercial mechanisms maintained, by the concealment the distance provided, by the non-acknowledgement the concealment permitted. The Tleilaxu's gender hierarchy was the institutional structure the axolotl tank's exploitation was embedded within, the social arrangement whose character the exploitation's sustained operation both reflected and required. The hierarchy was comprehensive. The Tleilaxu's social structure assigned the women the position the structure's lowest level encompassed, assigned the biological reproductive function institutional exploitation's purposes demanded, assigned the role the production's mechanisms utilized. The assignment was comprehensive, encompassed every woman that Tleilaxu's social structure included, applied the exploitation's institutional requirements to every female member the faction's population encompassed. The comprehensiveness was the hierarchy's most disturbing quality. The exploitation was not directed at the selected individuals the institutional selection's criteria identified. The exploitation was directed at the category, at the gender the hierarchy's structure identified as the category the exploitation encompassed. Every woman was the tank. Every female body was the manufacturing equipment. The exploitation was categorical rather than individual, was applied to the gender rather than to the person. The categorical character was the exploitation's institutional expression. The institution that exploited categorically, that applied the exploitation to the category rather than to the individual, was the institution whose exploitation's character was the institutional character rather than the individual character. The exploitation was the institution's practice rather than the individual's decision. The practice was maintained by the institutional mechanisms the practice's continuation required, was sustained by the institutional authority the practice's operation demanded. The institutional mechanisms were sustained by the religious tradition, the theological framework that Tleilaxu's religious culture maintained, the framework whose authority the institutional practices were conducted under, was the framework that provided the authorization the exploitation's sustained operation required. The authorization was theological, was the permission the religious tradition's institutional authority provided for the practice the tradition's theological framework sanctioned. The theological authorization was the exploitation's most consequential institutional support. The authorization that was theological, that was provided by the religious tradition's authority rather than by the political governance's authority, was the authorization whose durability exceeded the political authorization's durability. The theological authorization persisted regardless of the political conditions. The political authorization adapted to the political conditions. The persistence exceeded the adaptation. The theological support exceeded the political support. The persistence sustained the exploitation. The practice whose authorization was theological, whose institutional support was the religious tradition's authority, was the practice whose continuation the theological authorization's persistence sustained across the conditions the political landscape's changes generated. The exploitation continued because the authorization persisted. The authorization persisted because the authorization was theological. The theological was more persistent than the political. The biological production's mechanics, the operational processes the axolotl tank's institutional utilization encompassed were the mechanics whose examination reveals the exploitation's operational character alongside the exploitation's moral character. The mechanics involved the preparation. The women whose bodies the production utilized were prepared, were subjected to the biological procedures the production function's operation required, were converted from the autonomous persons the pre-preparation condition encompassed to the production facilities the post-preparation condition constituted. The preparation eliminated the autonomy. The women whose bodies were prepared for the production function's operation were the women whose autonomous consciousness was reduced, was diminished to the levels the production function's biological operation could accommodate, was managed through the mechanisms the preparation's institutional procedures employed. The autonomy's elimination was the preparation's most consequential operational quality. The preparation that eliminated the autonomy was the preparation that converted the person into the facility. that transformed the human being whose consciousness, the autonomy, constituted into the biological system, whose production, function, the conversion's institutional purposes specified. The conversion was comprehensive. The person was converted into the facility in every dimension the conversion encompassed, in the biological dimension, in the cognitive dimension, in the institutional dimension. The comprehensiveness was the conversion's most consequential quality for the moral argument's assessment, the conversion that encompassed every dimension. That transformed the person into the facility in the biological, the cognitive, and the institutional dimensions simultaneously, was the conversion whose moral character the comprehensiveness's scope constituted. The conversion was total. The totality was the moral violation's magnitude. The production utilized the converted bodies. The biological processes the production function encompassed, the ghola growth, the face dancer development, the biological solution manufacture the institutional demand required, were conducted through the converted bodies' biological systems. The systems performed the production function, generated the biological products the institutional demand consumed through the biological processes the system's operation sustained. The utilization was sustained. The converted bodies were maintained in the production function's operational condition across the duration the production's sustained operation encompassed. The maintenance was biological, was conducted through the provision of the metabolic inputs the biological system's continued operation required, was sustained through the management of the physiological conditions the production function's operation demanded. The sustained utilization was the exploitation's temporal dimension. The exploitation was not the single event, was not the momentary violation the single occurrence constituted. The exploitation was sustained, was maintained across the duration the production function's operation encompassed, was continued across the time the production's institutional demand sustained. In the heretics of Dune period, the Tleilaxu's institutional presence was expanded, was developed beyond the marginal position the previous period's secrecy maintained peripherality had sustained. The expansion was produced by the post-God, emperor, political landscape's institutional dynamics. The fragmented landscape, the political conditions the famine times disruptions and the scatterings dispersals had generated, was the landscape whose institutional dynamics the Tleilaxu's expanded presence occupied. The fragmented landscape's reduced institutional monitoring, the diminished surveillance the fragmentation's institutional disruptions had produced, was the condition the Tleilaxu's expanded operations exploited. The monitoring that had maintained the institutional landscape's awareness of the faction's operations during the centralized governance's periods was the monitoring the fragmentation had reduced. The reduced monitoring permitted the expanded operations. The expanded operations were the reduced monitoring's institutional consequence. The expansion included the face dancers' enhanced deployment. The later face dancers, the constructs whose capabilities exceeded the earlier version's limitations, were deployed in the expanded operations the reduced monitoring permitted. The deployment was broader, encompassed more targets, addressed more institutional actors, served more operational purposes than the previous period's constrained deployment had encompassed. The broader deployment was the faction's most consequential operational expansion. The face dancers, whose deployment was broader, were the face dancers whose infiltration encompassed more of the institutional landscape, whose presence was distributed across more of the landscape's institutional actors, whose operations affected more of the landscape's institutional dynamics. The Tleilaxu master's engagement with the Bene Gesserit during the Heretics period was the engagement the institutional dynamics post-God-Emperor conditions generated. The engagement was adversarial, was conducted within the relationship's adversarial character the previous period's competition had established. The engagement was also interactive. Was the sustained institutional interaction the landscape's dynamics required for the operations the engagement encompassed? Sheen's significance for the Tleilaxu was the significance the girl's relationship with the sandworms produced in the faction's institutional assessment. Sheen's capability, the ability to command the sandworms that exceeded the Fremen's riding relationship, was the capability the Tleilaxu's institutional assessment identified as the capability whose biological basis the faction's genetic engineering might exploit. The assessment was the faction's institutional interest expressed in the biological dimension. The faction whose institutional identity was the biological engineering's practice assessed every biological capability through the engineering's potential, evaluated every observed capability through the question of whether the engineering could replicate or exploit the capability the observation identified. The assessment was characteristic. The Tleilaxu assessed the world through the biological engineering's lens, evaluated every phenomenon through the question of the engineering's applicability, measured every capability through the engineering's potential exploitation. The lens was the faction's institutional perspective. The perceptual orientation the faction's institutional identity imposed on the faction's engagement with the world the identity was deployed within. In the Chapter House period, the Tleilaxu's institutional condition was the condition the Honored Matress's aggressive expansion had produced, the condition of the faction whose institutional operations the returning faction's destructive campaign had affected. The Honored Matress targeted the Tleilaxu, the returning faction, whose aggressive expansion encompassed the institutional actors the old Imperium's landscape included, targeted the Tleilaxu's institutional presence alongside the other targets the expansion encompassed. The targeting was destructive, was directed at the elimination of the Tleilaxu's institutional presence through the military operations the expansion's aggressive character produced. The destruction affected the Tleilaxu's institutional operations. The faction whose operations the destruction encompassed was the faction whose institutional capability the destruction reduced, whose production capacity the destruction diminished, whose operational resources the destruction consumed. Cytail's survival was the faction's institutional continuity's most consequential personal expression. The master whose continued presence the saga's later documentation encompassed was the person whose survival carried the faction's institutional knowledge and the faction's institutional authority beyond the destruction the Honored Matress's campaign had produced. Cytail carried the null entropy capsule. The device, the storage mechanism whose contents included the cellular material the ghola technology's biological replication required, was the device that preserved the faction's most valued institutional asset alongside the master's personal survival. The capsule's contents included the cells of significant persons, the biological material whose preservation the ghola technology's future deployment might utilize. The capsule was the faction's insurance. The device whose contents preserved the cellular material was the device whose preservation the faction's institutional continuity the device's contents sustained. The insurance was biological, was the preservation of the biological material the faction's most valued technology could deploy for the institutional purposes the preservation served. Cytail's presence aboard the No ship alongside Shiana and the Sandworms and the final Duncan Idaho ghola was the faction's representation in the departure the saga's final documented events encompassed. The master whose survival represented the faction's institutional continuity was the person whose departure carried the faction's institutional presence into the territories the departure's trajectory would reach. The departure was the faction's geographical expansion alongside the ecological expansion the sandworms' transportation constituted. The faction's institutional presence, carried by the surviving master, preserved in the nullentropy capsule's biological contents, was distributed into the territories the departure reached alongside the sandworm ecology the transportation encompassed. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the spice was the relationship the faction's biological capabilities' institutional dependency generated. The connection between the biological production the faction's institutional identity was organized around and the substance the production's biological mechanisms consumed. The axolotl tanks consumed the spice. The biological production the tank's operation encompassed, the ghola growth, the face dancer development, the biological processes the production function sustained, required the spice's biochemical contribution to the biological mechanisms the production utilized. The spice was the production's biochemical input, was the substance the biological system's enhanced operation consumed alongside the metabolic inputs the system's ordinary functioning required. The consumption created the dependency. The production whose biological mechanisms consumed the spice was the production whose continued operation depended on the spice's continued provision. The dependency was operational, was the relationship the production's biochemical requirements imposed on the faction's institutional operations alongside the operational relationships the other institutional requirements generated. The dependency connected the Tleilaxu to Arrakis. The faction whose production consumed the spice was the faction whose operations depended on the ecology the spice was produced by, was connected to the sandworm life cycle the spice's production encompassed through the biochemical dependency the production's consumption constituted. The connection was the dependency chain's expression. The chain ran from the Tleilaxu's production, through the spice, through the sandworm ecology, through the Arrakis environment, each link contingent on the preceding link's sustained operation, each link necessary for the succeeding link's continued functioning. The chain's vulnerability was the faction's vulnerability. The Tleilaxu, whose production depended on the spice, were the Tleilaxu whose operations were vulnerable to the spice supply's disruption, were subject to the consequences the supply's interruption would have produced in the production's biological mechanisms functioning. The vulnerability was addressed by the production's scope. The Tleilaxu, whose biological engineering encompassed the genetic manipulation, were the Tleilaxu whose engineering capabilities might have included the development of the spice dependency's biological mitigation. The possibility was present in the faction's capabilities' scope, was encompassed by the engineering tradition's technological range, alongside the other possibilities the range included. The possibility's realization was not documented. The saga's texts did not document the Tleilaxu's development of the spice dependency's mitigation, did not describe the engineering's application to the dependency's biological reduction. The non-documentation was the possibility's uncertain status, the condition of the capability whose development the documentation's absence left unconfirmed. The Tleilaxu's philosophical significance was the significance the faction's institutional character produced in the saga's sustained argument about the relationship between the biological capability and the moral constraint. The argument about whether the capability's development should be pursued without the constraint's limitation, or whether the constraint's limitation should govern the capability's pursuit. The argument's two positions were embodied in the two factions. The Tleilaxu embodied the position that the capability's development should be pursued without the constraint's limitation, that the biological engineering's products should be generated through whatever methods the engineering's technological capability permitted, that the method's moral character was secondary to the product's institutional value. The Bene Gesserit embodied the position that the constraints limitation should govern the capabilities pursuit, that the biological development's methods should be conducted within the moral parameters the development's ethical assessment specified, that the method's moral character was primary alongside the product's institutional value. The two positions produced the two institutional cultures. The Tleilaxu's culture was the culture the unconstrained pursuit generated, the culture in which the capabilities development proceeded without the moral assessment the constraint would have imposed, the culture in which the method's ethical character was not the factor the development's direction was determined by. The Bene Gesserit's culture was the culture the constrained pursuit generated, the culture in which the capabilities development was conducted within the ethical assessment the constraints parameters specified, the culture in which the method's moral character participated in the determination of the development's direction. The two cultures produced the two sets of products. The Tleilaxu's products, the gholas, the face dancers, the biological solutions the unconstrained development generated, were the products whose production methods included the moral violation the axolotl tank's exploitation constituted. The Bene Gesserit's products, the trained practitioners, the biological capabilities the cultivation's institutional development generated, were the products whose production methods did not include the moral violation the exploitation constituted. The comparison demonstrated the argument's conclusion. The conclusion said, the constrained development produced the products without the moral violation. The unconstrained development produced the products with the moral violation. The constraint's limitation did not prevent the product's generation. The constraint's limitation prevented the violation's commission. The prevention was the constraint's value, was the quality the limitation provided alongside the limitation's costs the constraint imposed. The constraint's costs were the argument's complication. The constrained development's products were not identical to the unconstrained development's products. The Bene Gesserit could not produce the gholas. The Bene Gesserit could not produce the face dancers. The products the constrained development generated were the products the constraint's limitations permitted, were the products whose production methods the ethical assessment's parameters encompassed. The non-identity was the argument's tension. The unconstrained development produced the products the constrained development could not. The constrained development maintained the moral integrity the unconstrained development violated. The products and the integrity were both the values the argument encompassed. The tension between the product's availability and the integrity's maintenance was the tension the argument's sustained examination addressed. The examination's conclusion was nuanced. The argument did not declare the unconstrained development absolutely wrong, did not assert the capability's pursuit was categorically impermissible. The argument declared the unconstrained development conditionally wrong, declared the development wrong when the development's methods included the moral violations the development's products did not require. The conditionality was the conclusion's character, was the quality that assessed the development through the method's moral character alongside the product's institutional value. The conditionality's assessment of the Tleilaxu concluded the violation was not required. The axolotl tank's exploitation was not the necessary condition the ghola technology's operation demanded, was not the indispensable method the production's biological mechanisms could not proceed without. The exploitation was the chosen method, was the method the Tleilaxu's institutional culture had selected from the methods the biological engineering's technological range encompassed. The chosen character was the exploitation's most consequential moral quality. The exploitation that was chosen rather than necessary was the exploitation whose moral assessment the choice's voluntary character informed, was the violation whose moral condemnation the choice's availability of the alternative methods justified. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the prohibition against artificial intelligence was the relationship that connected the faction's biological engineering to the civilization's foundational cognitive decision. The relationship between the faction's technological capabilities and the prohibition's mandate that the cognitive functions be provided through biological means. The prohibition said, develop the biological. The Tleilaxu developed the biological. The development was the prohibition's mandate's fulfillment. The fulfillment was the faction's institutional alignment with the prohibition's direction, was the faction's position within the prohibition's framework as the institution whose biological development the prohibition's direction authorized. The alignment was the Tleilaxu's institutional legitimacy's foundation. The faction whose biological development the prohibition authorized was the faction whose institutional position the authorization sustained, was the institution whose presence in the institutional landscape the prohibition's framework justified through the authorization the mandate provided. The authorization was complicated by the methods. The prohibition that authorized the biological development did not authorize the exploitation the development's methods encompassed. The prohibition said, develop the biological. The prohibition did not say, develop the biological through the exploitation of persons. The authorization's scope encompassed the development's direction. The authorization's scope did not encompass the development's methods. The scope's limitation was the Tleilaxu's institutional legitimacy's complication. The faction whose development the prohibition authorized was also the faction whose methods the prohibition's moral framework did not sanction. The authorization and the non-sanction coexisted, were both present in the same institutional assessment, were both the prohibition's contributions to the faction's institutional conditions evaluation. The coexistence was the Tleilaxu's most consequential institutional quality. The faction was both authorized and non-sanctioned, was both the institution whose biological development the prohibition's direction supported, and the institution whose methods the prohibition's moral implications condemned. Herbert's argument about exploitation and secrecy was the argument the Tleilaxu's institutional character embodied. The argument about the relationship between the exploitation's moral character and the secrecy's institutional concealment the exploitation's continuation required. The argument said, the exploitation requires the secrecy. The practice whose moral character the external assessment would condemn is the practice whose continuation the concealment from the assessment sustains. The secrecy is the exploitation's institutional defense, the mechanism through which the exploitation is maintained despite the moral condemnation the exposure would produce. The requirement was demonstrated. The Tleilaxu maintained the secrecy. The secrecy maintained the exploitation. The exploitation continued because the secrecy concealed the exploitation from the external assessment the condemnation would have generated. The demonstration was the argument's evidence, was the institutional history through which the argument's claim was supported by the faction's operational practice. The argument extended. The secrecy corrupts the institution. The institution that maintains the secrecy for the exploitation's concealment is the institution whose institutional culture the secrecy's sustained maintenance corrupts. The corruption is the secrecy's institutional consequence, is the effect the sustained concealment produces in the institution whose operations the concealment encompasses. The corruption operated through the normalization. The exploitation that was concealed, that was maintained behind the secrecy's institutional barriers, was the exploitation that was normalized within the concealing institution. The normalization was the concealment's internal consequence, was the effect the sustained concealment produced in the institution's members' assessment of the practice the concealment protected. The normalized exploitation was the exploitation the institution's members did not perceive as the exploitation, was the practice the members assessed as the institutional operation rather than as the moral violation. The non-perception was the normalization's product, was generated by the sustained concealment's effect on the member's moral assessment, was produced by the secrecy's maintenance of the conditions under which the assessment's moral dimension was not activated. The non-activation was the corruption. The moral assessment that was not activated, that was maintained in the dormant condition the normalization sustained, was the assessment whose non-activation constituted the institutional corruption the secrecy produced. The argument's conclusion said, the secrecy and the exploitation are inseparable. The exploitation that requires the secrecy cannot be separated from the secrecy that maintains the exploitation. The secrecy that conceals the exploitation cannot be assessed separately from the exploitation the secrecy conceals. The two are connected, are the two dimensions of the same institutional practice, are the two elements of the same moral condition. The connection was the argument's most consequential finding. The finding said, address the secrecy and the exploitation is exposed. Address the exploitation and the secrecy is unnecessary. The two are addressed together because the two are sustained together. The revelation was the addressing. The exposure of the axolotl tank's true nature. The documentation of the secret the secrecy had concealed was the addressing the argument identified as the secrecy's and the exploitation's simultaneous confrontation. The exposure addressed the secrecy by eliminating the concealment. The elimination addressed the exploitation by enabling the assessment the concealment had prevented. The Tleilaxu's institutional fate across the saga was the fate the faction's institutional character produced through the consequences the character's operations generated. The trajectory the faction followed across the documented events the saga encompassed. The trajectory was the trajectory from the concealed margin to the exposed center. The faction that had maintained the marginal position the secrecy's institutional requirements sustained, that had operated in the institutional landscape's periphery the concealment's conditions demanded, was the faction whose position was progressively modified by the events the saga's timeline produced. The modification was the event's product. The conspiracy's engagement brought the faction closer to the center. The God Emperor's demand sustained the faction's commercial relationship with the governance. The post-God Emperor fragmentation expanded the faction's operational scope. The Honored Mattress's destruction reduced the faction's institutional presence. The No-Ship's departure distributed the faction's surviving representation into the unknown territories. The trajectory's direction was the direction from the concealment toward the exposure, from the secrecy's maintained opacity toward the revelation's produced transparency. The direction was not chosen, was not the trajectory the faction's institutional decisions had specified. The direction was the event's consequence, was produced by the dynamics the timeline's developments generated rather than by the choices the faction's governance made. The non-chosen character was the trajectory's most consequential quality. The faction whose institutional culture maintained the secrecy was the faction whose institutional trajectory moved toward the exposure the secrecy was designed to prevent. The maintenance and the trajectory were in conflict. The maintenance sustained the secrecy, while the trajectory moved toward the secrecy's elimination. The conflict was the tension. The sustained dynamic between the faction's institutional effort and the timeline's developmental direction. The timeline won. The secrecy was exposed. The exploitation was revealed. The assessment was enabled. The condemnation was produced. The timeline's developmental direction exceeded the institutional effort's maintenance capacity, moved the faction toward the exposure despite the effort's sustained opposition to the movement the exposure constituted. The winning was the saga's verdict. The saga whose timeline moved the faction toward the exposure was the saga whose institutional dynamics exceeded the faction's concealment's capacity, whose events' developmental force exceeded the secrecy's maintenance's resistance. The verdict was, the secrecy cannot be sustained indefinitely. The exploitation cannot be concealed permanently. The moral assessment cannot be prevented forever. The verdict was the argument's conclusion applied to the timeline. The argument that said the secrecy and the exploitation were inseparable was the argument whose timeline applied conclusion said the inseparable secrecy and exploitation would be addressed together when the timeline's events produced the exposure the secrecy's maintenance could not prevent. The Tleilaxu's legacy was the legacy the faction's institutional history produced in the saga's accumulated argument, the contribution the faction's story made to the saga's sustained examination of the relationship between the capability and the morality the capability's deployment encompassed. The legacy was the cautionary dimension, the faction whose story demonstrated the exploitation the unconstrained capability produced was the faction whose legacy the cautionary character constituted. The caution said the capability can be developed without the constraint. The development without the constraint produces the exploitation. The exploitation is the development's moral consequence. The consequence is the caution's content. The legacy was also the secrecy dimension. The faction whose story demonstrated the secrecy the exploitation required was the faction whose legacy the secrecy's cautionary character encompassed alongside the exploitation's cautionary character. The caution said the exploitation requires the secrecy. The secrecy corrupts the institution. The corruption is the secrecy's institutional consequence. The consequence is the caution's additional content. The dual caution about the unconstrained capability and about the concealing secrecy was the legacy's comprehensive content. The faction whose story demonstrated both cautions was the faction whose legacy the dual demonstration constituted. The demonstration was the contribution. The faction story's addition to the saga's accumulated argument about the capability and the morality the argument examined. The contribution was consequential. The saga's argument about the biological capability's moral dimensions, about the relationship between the capability's development and the morality the development's methods encompassed, was the argument the Tleilaxu's story's contribution enriched. The enrichment was the cautionary dimension's addition, the demonstration of what the unconstrained development and the concealing secrecy produced when the development and the secrecy was sustained across the institutional history the demonstration encompassed. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu was the history of the caution, the sustained demonstration of the exploitation the unconstrained capability produced and the secrecy the exploitation required, and the corruption the secrecy generated. The secret was the women. The exploitation was the production. The secrecy was the concealment. The corruption was the normalization. The faction operated for millennia. The secrecy was maintained for centuries. The exploitation was sustained across the generations the secrecy protected. The revelation exposed the secret. The assessment condemned the practice. The condemnation was the verdict. The Bene Tleilaxu. the faction that could produce the biological miracles, the gholas, the face dancers, the biological solutions the civilization demanded, the faction whose miracles were produced through the exploitation the secrecy concealed, the faction whose secrecy corrupted the institution the secrecy protected. The entire history. The caution. The secret was the women. The secret was always the women. The ghola technology's political implications were the implications the resurrection capability produced in the Imperium's political landscape, the consequences the technology's availability generated in the institutional dynamics the capability's deployment affected. The resurrection capability changed the death's political character. The death that had been the permanent removal, the definitive elimination of the person from the political landscape's active dimension, was converted by the ghola technology into the temporary removal. The person who died could be resurrected. The resurrection could restore the body. The body's restoration could, through the identity recovery the emotional crisis triggered, restore the person. The conversion was consequential. The political landscape, whose competitive dynamics included the assassination, the war of assassins the Canley framework authorized, the targeted killing, the competitive violence's concentrated form constituted, was the landscape whose assassination's finality the ghola technology potentially undermined. The assassination that killed the target was the assassination whose permanence the resurrection's availability questioned. The questioning was institutional. The institutional actors whose competitive operations included the assassination assessed the assassination's effectiveness against the resurrection's availability. The assessment concluded the assassination's effectiveness was reduced. The reduction was the resurrection's product, was generated by the technology's availability's modification of the death's political finality. The reduced effectiveness changed the assassination's political calculation. The competitive actors whose operations included the assassination recalculated the assassination's value, reassessed the investment the assassination required against the returns the assassination's reduced permanence provided. The recalculation concluded the assassination's returns were diminished by the resurrection's availability. The diminishment changed the calculation's outcome. The changed outcome was the technology's most consequential political contribution. The technology that changed the death's political character changed the political calculation the death's character informed. The changed calculation changed the political behavior the calculation directed. The political behavior's change was the technology's political contribution, was the modification of the institutional landscape's competitive dynamics the technology's availability produced. The modification was subtle. The ghola technology did not eliminate the assassination. The technology did not prevent the killing. The technology modified the killing's consequences, converted the permanent removal into the potentially temporary removal, changed the elimination's finality into the elimination's conditional character. The modification was the technology's contribution rather than the revolution, was the adjustment of the dynamic's character rather than the transformation of the dynamic's existence. The Tleilaxu's commercial operations were the operations through which the faction's biological products were distributed to the institutional consumers the product's demand encompassed. The commercial mechanisms the faction maintained for the product's delivery to the markets the demand sustained. The operations were managed through the secrecy. The commercial activities the product's distribution encompassed, the transactions, the deliveries, the pricing negotiations the commerce generated, were conducted through the mechanisms the secrecy's requirements shaped. The transactions were discrete. The deliveries were managed. The negotiations were conducted within the confidentiality the secrecy's institutional culture imposed. The secrecy's commercial dimension was the dimension through which the product's distribution was maintained without the production's methods exposure the distribution's commercial interactions might have generated. The commercial interactions were managed to prevent the exposure, were conducted with the discretion the secrecy's maintenance required, were calibrated to the confidentiality the production's concealment demanded. The pricing reflected the product's institutional value alongside the production's operational costs. The gholas pricing, the commercial value the Resurrection Technologies products were exchanged for, was the pricing the institutional demand's magnitude and the production's biological costs magnitude combined to determine. The pricing was high, reflected the product's value, the demand's sustained presence demonstrated alongside the production's costs the biological mechanisms operation encompassed. The face dancer's pricing was determined by the product's intelligence value alongside the production's operational costs. The face dancers whose shape-shifting capability the intelligence operations deployed were the products whose pricing the intelligence values assessment determined alongside the production costs assessment the pricing encompassed. The commercial relationships were sustained across the centuries the product's demand maintained. The institutional consumers whose demand the product's availability served were the consumers whose commercial relationships with the Tleilaxu the demand's sustained presence maintained. The relationships were long-term, were sustained across the decades and the centuries the demand's continuation encompassed. The long-term character was the relationship's most consequential quality. The commercial relationships that were maintained across the centuries were the relationships whose institutional significance exceeded the individual transaction's significance, whose accumulated commercial history exceeded the single exchange's commercial content. The accumulated history was the relationship's institutional foundation. The consumers who had maintained the commercial relationship across the centuries were the consumers whose institutional assessment of the Tleilaxu was informed by the history the relationship encompassed. By the decades and the centuries of the transactions the relationship's sustained operation had produced. The history informed, but did not eliminate the distrust. The consumers whose commercial history with the Tleilaxu was sustained across the centuries were the consumers whose distrust of the Tleilaxu's institutional character the commercial history's sustained operation did not eliminate. The history sustained the commerce. The history did not eliminate the suspicion. The commerce and the suspicion coexisted, were both maintained across the centuries the relationship's institutional operation encompassed. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the Emperor was the relationship the commercial and the political dimensions combined to produce. The institutional interaction the faction's products demand and the governance's political authority generated. The Emperor consumed the Tleilaxu's products. The governance whose institutional operations the Tleilaxu's biological products served was the governance whose commercial relationship with the Tleilaxu the consumption maintained. The Emperor's consumption included the intelligence dimension, included the face dancer's deployment, the intelligence operations the governance's political management encompassed, utilized. The consumption produced the relationship's commercial dimension. The Emperor who consumed the products was the Emperor whose commercial interaction with the Tleilaxu the consumption sustained. The interaction was managed, was conducted through the mechanisms the institutional framework's commercial practices encompassed, was calibrated to the protocols the governance's commercial management specified. The relationship also included the political dimension. The Emperor whose governance managed the Imperium's institutional landscape was the Emperor whose political authority encompassed the assessment of the Tleilaxu's institutional operations. The assessment was informed by the distrust, by the governance's evaluation of the faction's institutional character, the secrecy's opacity generated. The political dimension's distrust and the commercial dimension's consumption coexisted. The emperor who distrusted the Tleilaxu also consumed the Tleilaxu's products. The distrust and the consumption were simultaneous, were both present in the governance's relationship with the faction, were both the dimensions the relationship encompassed. The simultaneity was the relationship's defining quality. The governance that maintained the distrust alongside the consumption was the governance whose relationship with the faction the simultaneity constituted. The relationship was not simple, was not the straightforward commercial exchange or the straightforward political assessment. The relationship was complex, was the combination of the commercial consumption and the political distrust the complexity constituted. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the Landsraad was the relationship the noble house's collective institutional dynamics produced in the interaction with the faction whose biological products the house's individual demands consumed. The houses consumed individually. The noble houses whose institutional operations the Tleilaxu's products served were the houses whose individual commercial relationships with the Tleilaxu, the individual consumption, sustained. The individual consumption was varied, reflected the individual houses' varying demands for the products the Tleilaxu's biological capabilities provided. The houses distrusted collectively. The Landsraad's collective assessment of the Tleilaxu, the political landscape's institutional evaluation of the faction's character, was the assessment the collective distrust constituted. The collective distrust was sustained through the institutional dynamics the Landsraad's political culture maintained, through the shared assessment the house's collective evaluation produced. The individual consumption and the collective distrust coexisted. The houses that consumed individually, distrusted collectively, maintained the commercial relationships the individual demands sustained alongside the institutional suspicion the collective assessment generated. The coexistence was the Tleilaxu's Landsraad-related condition, the condition of the faction whose products were consumed by the institutions whose collective assessment distrusted the faction. The condition was sustained, was maintained across the periods the commercial consumption and the collective distrust simultaneously encompassed. The Landsraad's collective distrust was the distrust the secrecy produced in the political landscape's institutional culture. The opacity the Tleilaxu maintained, the concealment the secrecy's mechanisms sustained around the faction's institutional operations, was the opacity the Landsraad's collective culture assessed as the indicator the distrust's maintenance warranted. The distrust's maintenance was the collective culture's response to the opacity. The political culture whose assessment of the institutional actors the assessment encompassed included the transparency's evaluation as the trustworthiness's indicator assessed the Tleilaxu's opacity as the untrustworthiness's indicator. The assessment was cultural, was produced by the culture's values rather than by the individual's evaluation, was generated by the collective's norms rather than by the particular's assessment. Bijaz was the Tleilaxu operative whose role in the Dune Messiah narrative demonstrated the faction's operational methods alongside the ghola technology's political deployment. The person whose activities the conspiracy's institutional coordination encompassed. Bijaz was a Tleilaxu dwarf. The operative whose physical characteristics included the reduced stature the physical description documented was the operative whose institutional role the conspiracy's operations encompassed. The physical description was the narrative's rendering of the person the institutional role's documentation addressed, was the character whose physical and institutional dimensions the narrative's attention documented. Bijaz's capabilities included the programming. The operative, whose institutional role the conspiracy encompassed, possessed the capability for the biological programming the Tleilaxu's technological tradition maintained, the ability to install the behavioral directives the programming's mechanisms could embed in the biological subjects the programming was applied to. The programming capability connected Bajaz to the ghola. The operative, whose programming capability the institutional role encompassed, was the operative whose programming the ghola's biological systems were the subject of, was the person whose capability the behavioral directives installation in the hate ghola's biological architecture the conspiracy's design specified. The directives were the conspiracy's operational mechanism. The behavioral instructions the programming installed in the ghola's biological systems, the commands the programming's mechanisms embedded in the biological architecture the commands were directed at, were the instructions the conspiracy's operational timeline specified for the ghola's activation at the moments the conspiracy's design required. The programming was biological rather than mechanical. The directives were installed through the biological mechanisms that Tleilaxu's technological tradition maintained rather than through the computational mechanisms the prohibition against artificial intelligence prevented. The biological character was the programming's institutional legitimacy's foundation, was the quality that placed the programming within the prohibition's biological development mandate rather than within the prohibition's computational prohibition. The biological character was also the programming's moral dimension. The programming that installed the behavioral directives in the biological person's systems was the programming that subverted the person's autonomy through the biological mechanisms the programming employed. The subversion was the programming's moral quality, was the moral character the autonomy's biological override constituted. The subversion connected the programming to the axolotl tank's exploitation. The programming that overrode the person's autonomy through the biological mechanisms was the programming that paralleled the exploitation's override of the women's autonomy through the biological mechanisms the exploitation employed. The parallel was the institutional consistency, was the faction's sustained practice of the biological autonomy's override through the mechanisms the faction's technological tradition maintained. The consistency was the faction's institutional character's expression. The faction that overrode the autonomy through the axolotl tanks also overrode the autonomy through the programming. The two overrides were the same institutional practice as different applications, with the biological autonomy's subversion applied in the production's dimension and in the operational dimension through the different mechanisms the respective applications employed. The Tleilaxu's most ambitious project was the project the saga's later documentation suggested, the project whose scope exceeded the individual product's production, and that addressed the faction's institutional ambitions at the civilizational scale the ambitions encompassed. The project was the face dancer infiltration. The deployment of the enhanced face dancers, the later versions whose capabilities exceeded the earlier versions' limitations, across the institutional landscape's actors was the project whose scope encompassed the landscape's comprehensive infiltration rather than the individual actors' targeted infiltration. The comprehensive infiltration was the project's ambition. The faction whose operational history had included the individual deployments the targeted infiltration encompassed, whose face dancers had been deployed against the individual targets the individual operations specified, was the faction whose ambition the comprehensive infiltration's scope expressed. The ambition was the institutional character's most consequential expression. The faction that aspired to the comprehensive infiltration, that deployed the enhanced face dancers across the institutional landscape's comprehensive extent, was the faction whose institutional ambitions the comprehensive scope demonstrated. The ambition's relationship with the secrecy was the relationship the comprehensive infiltration's covert character produced, the infiltration that was conducted covertly, that was deployed behind the appearances the shape-shifting generated, that was maintained without the detection the appearances' disguise prevented, was the infiltration whose covert character the secrecy's institutional culture sustained. The secrecy was the infiltration's operational requirement. The infiltration that depended on the non-detection for the infiltration's effectiveness was the infiltration whose operation the secrecy's institutional practices supported. The practices that maintained the institutional concealment across the centuries the secrecy's operation encompassed were the practices that supported the operational concealment the face dancer's infiltration required. The support was institutional. The secrecy's practices, developed across the centuries of the institutional concealment's maintenance, were the practices whose operational capabilities the infiltration's covert requirements deployed. The practices were transferred, were applied from the institutional concealment's dimension to the operational concealment's dimension through the transfer the capabilities' shared requirements permitted. The transfer demonstrated the secrecy's institutional versatility. The concealment practices that maintained the institutional secrecy, that sustained the homeworld's opacity, the production method's concealment, the axolotl tank secret, were the practices that also sustained the operational secrecy the face dancer's infiltration required. The practices served both dimensions, served the institutional concealment and the operational concealment through the shared capabilities the practice's operational character encompassed. The Tleilaxu's self-understanding was the understanding the faction maintained of the faction's institutional character, the self-assessment the faction's institutional culture produced in the members the culture encompassed. The self-understanding was religious. The faction understood itself through the religious framework the tradition maintained. Through the theological categories, the tradition's institutional authority provided for the self-assessment the understanding constituted. The framework said, the faction serves the divine purpose. The biological capabilities are the divine gifts. The production's methods are the divine authorization's expression. The religious self-understanding was the self-image's content. The faction whose self-assessment was conducted through the theological framework was the faction whose self-image the framework's categories constituted. The image said, the faction is righteous. The operations are sanctioned, the methods are authorized. The image's relationship with the external assessment was the relationship the discrepancy between the internal and the external evaluations constituted. The internal assessment said, righteous. The external assessment said, suspicious. The internal said, sanctioned. The external said, concealed. The discrepancy was the relationship, was the distance between the self-image the internal assessment produced and the institutional assessment the external evaluation generated. The discrepancy was not perceived by the faction. The institution whose self-understanding was conducted through the religious framework was the institution whose perception of the external assessment was filtered through the framework's categories. The framework's categories said, the external assessment is the outsider's misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is the outsider's failure to perceive the divine authorization the framework's authority provides. The non-perception of the discrepancy was the self-understanding's most consequential limitation. The faction that could not perceive the discrepancy, that could not assess the distance between the self-image and the external assessment, was the faction whose institutional operations were conducted without the self-awareness the discrepancy's perception would have provided. The non-self-awareness was the institutional culture's product. The culture that maintained the religious framework's authority over the self-assessment was the culture that maintained the non-self-awareness the framework's filtering produced. The culture was closed, was maintained within the framework's categories without the external assessment's corrective input the openness would have provided. The closure was the institutional culture's most consequential quality, alongside the secrecy's institutional concealment. The culture that was closed, that assessed itself through the internal framework without the external assessment's corrective influence, was the culture whose self-understanding the closure's filtering sustained at the levels the filtering produced. The self-understanding was therefore uncorrected. The faction's assessment of its own institutional character was the assessment the closure's filtering maintained without the correction the external assessment would have provided. The uncorrected assessment was the faction's institutional condition, was the condition under which the faction's operations were conducted, the condition under which the faction's decisions were made, the condition under which the faction's institutional trajectory was determined. The condition produced the trajectory. The faction whose self-understanding was uncorrected was the faction whose institutional trajectory, the uncorrected understanding, directed, whose operations were guided by the uncorrected self-assessment, whose decisions were informed by the uncorrected evaluation, whose institutional direction was determined by the uncorrected understanding the closure sustained. The trajectory's consequences were the consequences the uncorrected direction produced. The faction whose operations were directed by the uncorrected self-assessment was the faction whose consequences the uncorrected direction generated, whose institutional outcomes the uncorrected operations produced, whose institutional fate the uncorrected trajectory determined. The fate was the timelines. The faction's institutional trajectory, directed by the uncorrected self, understanding the closed culture's religious framework sustained, was the trajectory whose destination the timeline's events determined. The events moved the faction toward the exposure the secrecy was designed to prevent. The events moved the faction toward the destruction the honored matress's aggression produced. The events moved the faction toward the remnant Cytail's survival represented. The trajectory from the concealed power to the exposed remnant was the trajectory the uncorrected self-understanding produced through the institutional operations the understanding directed. The trajectory was the faction's institutional history compressed, the millennia of the concealed operation moving toward the exposure, and the destruction the concealment could not indefinitely prevent. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu, the faction of secrets, the faction of biological miracles, the faction of moral violations concealed behind the institutional secrecy centuries sustained, the gholas, the face dancers, the axolotl tanks, the women, the biological capability deployed without the moral constraint, the moral violation concealed behind the institutional secrecy, the secrecy corrupting the institutional culture, the culture producing the uncorrected self-understanding, the understanding directing the institutional trajectory, the trajectory moving toward the exposure the secrecy could not prevent. The entire history was the caution, the capability without the constraint, the secrecy without the accountability, the exploitation without the assessment. The women were the tanks. The tanks were the women. The secret was always the women. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu, the ghola technology's deployment across the saga's documented instances, was the deployment whose individual cases illuminated the technology's character in the varying circumstances each case's events encompassed. The hate ghola was the technology's first documented deployment in the saga's primary narrative. The biological resurrection of Duncan Idaho, produced through the axolotl tank's mechanisms for the Dune Messiah conspiracy's purposes, was the deployment whose circumstances the conspiracy's institutional coordination shaped and whose consequences the conspiracy's events generated. The hate deployment was instrumental. The ghola was produced as the instrument, was manufactured for the conspiracy's purposes rather than for the person's benefit, was deployed for the institutional objectives rather than for the individual's recovery. The instrumental character was the deployment's most consequential quality for the moral argument, was the quality that made the deployment the institutional exploitation rather than the humanitarian provision. The instrumental deployment's moral character was complicated by the identity recovery. The ghola that was deployed as the instrument that was manufactured for the conspiracy's exploitation rather than for the person's restoration was the ghola whose biological substrate contained the identity the emotional crisis could recover. The instrument became the person. The exploitation's product became the recovery's subject. The deployment's instrumental character was converted into the deployment's humanitarian consequence through the identity recovery the conspiracy's events triggered. The conversion was the technology's most paradoxical quality. The technology that was deployed exploitatively produced the humanitarian consequence the exploitation was not designed to generate. The exploitation's product exceeded the exploitation's purpose. The instrument's biological substrate contained the person the instrument's deployment was not designed to recover. The person was recovered despite the deployment's purposes. The recovery was the technology's contribution to the outcome despite the technology's deployment's intentions. The paradox illuminated the ghola technology's character. The technology was morally neutral in its capability, was the biological replication whose product's moral character was determined by the deployment's purposes rather than by the technology's nature. The technology could be deployed instrumentally. The technology could produce the humanitarian consequence. The deployment and the consequence were the human decision's products rather than the technology's inherent qualities. The God Emperor's Duncan Idaho gholas were the technology's most sustained deployment. The successive resurrections, produced across the millennia of the God Emperor's governance, were the deployments whose sustained operation the governance's institutional demand maintained. Each ghola was a person. The biological replicas whose production the successive resurrections constituted were the persons whose consciousness the biological substrate's identity recovery could produce, were the individuals whose personalities the emotional conditions the governance's circumstances generated could activate from the dormancy the biological memory sustained. Each person was different. The successive Duncan Idaho gholas, produced from the same cellular material, carrying the same genetics, possessing the same biological substrate, were the persons whose individual development the varying circumstances each ghola encountered produced differently. The genetics were the same, the circumstances were different. The different circumstances produced the different persons the same genetics inhabited. The difference was the God Emperor's experimental data. Leto's sustained production of the Duncan Idaho gholas, the millennia-spanning series the governance's demand maintained, was the experiment whose data the successive gholas' different developments produced. Each ghola's response to the governance's conditions was data, was the information the ghola's individual development generated through the individual circumstances the governance provided. The data accumulated. Each successive ghola's development added to the data the preceding ghola's developments had generated. The accumulation was the experiment's product. Was the sustained collection the millennia of the successive productions provided. The accumulated data was the God Emperor's assessment, was the information, the governance's experimental purpose, the successive gholas' production sustained. The Tleilaxu's melange production was the faction's most ambitious biological engineering project alongside the ghola technology. The attempt to produce the spice through the biological engineering's mechanisms rather than through the sandworm ecology's natural processes. The ambition was consequential. The faction that could produce the spice, that could manufacture the melange through the biological engineering's technological capabilities, would have been the faction whose institutional position the production's availability would have transformed. The spice production's geographical concentration, the dependency on the Arrakis ecology's natural processes the spice's exclusive production encompassed, would have been broken by the engineering's alternative production's availability. The breaking would have been the institutional landscape's most consequential transformation. The concentration that made Arrakis the civilization's most important planet, that organized the political, the economic, and the navigational systems around the single planet's ecology, would have been reduced by the alternative production's availability. The reduction would have changed every dimension the concentration affected, would have modified the political dynamics, the economic relationships, the navigational dependencies the concentration's architecture sustained. The Tleilaxu pursued the alternative production. The faction whose biological engineering encompassed the genetic manipulation and the biological system's technological modification was the faction whose institutional capabilities included the potential for the spice's synthetic production through the engineering the capabilities encompassed. The pursuit was sustained. The Tleilaxu invested the institutional resources the pursuit required, applied the biological engineering's capabilities to the spice production's challenge across the periods the pursuit's sustained operation encompassed. The investment was the ambition's institutional expression, was the resource allocation, the institutional purpose, the alternative production's development constituted. The pursuit's success was partial. The Tleilaxu produced the melange's approximation, generated the substance whose properties approached the natural spice's properties through the engineering the approximation's production employed. The approximation was not the replication, was not the identical substance the natural ecology's processes produced. The approximation was the engineering's best product, was the closest result the biological engineering's technological capabilities could achieve given the natural production's biochemical complexity the engineering was attempting to replicate. The approximation's limitations were the natural process's complexity's consequences. The sandworm life cycle's biochemical operations, the processes whose natural operation generated the melange the ecology produced, were the operations whose complexity exceeded the engineering's replication's capacity. The complexity was the engineering's boundary, was the limit beyond which the biological engineering's technological capabilities could not produce the replication the natural process's complexity constituted. The boundary was the Tleilaxu's most consequential technological limitation in the spice dimension. The faction whose ambition encompassed the alternative production was the faction whose technological capabilities the natural process's complexity bounded. The ambition exceeded the capability. The boundary was the capability's limit. The limit constrained the ambition. The constrained ambition was the faction's spice-related institutional condition. The faction that aspired to the alternative production, but whose technological capabilities the natural process's complexity bounded, was the faction whose institutional position the constraint maintained at the level the constraint's limitation specified. The faction could not break the concentration. The concentration persisted. The persistence was the boundary's product. The face dancer's autonomous evolution was the development the saga's later documentation suggested. The progression of the face dancer's capabilities beyond the Tleilaxu's institutional management's control toward the autonomous operation the progression's advanced stages produced. The evolution was progressive. The face dancers whose capabilities exceeded the earlier version's limitations, whose shape shifting the enhanced replication's comprehensiveness encompassed, whose cognitive capabilities the enhanced consciousness the progression generated, were the face dancers whose development the progressive enhancement's sustained operation had produced across the generations the development encompassed. The progression approached the autonomy. The face dancers whose capabilities enhancement progressed toward the levels the autonomous operation required, whose consciousness's development approached the self-directed operation the autonomy constituted, were the face dancers whose progression the Tleilaxu's institutional management assessed with the concern the autonomy's approach generated. The concern was the control's vulnerability. The Tleilaxu, whose institutional operations depended on the face dancer's instrumental deployment, whose intelligence operations utilized the face dancers as the tools the operation's covert requirements specified, were the Tleilaxu whose institutional control the face dancers' autonomous progression threatened. The threat was the instrument's potential independence. The face dancers that were deployed as the instruments, that were utilized for the institutional purposes the deployment specified, were the face dancers whose developing autonomy might have converted the instruments into the agents, might have transformed the tools into the persons whose self-directed operation the institutional control could not manage. The conversion would have been the institutional control's most consequential loss. The instruments that became the agents would have been the tools that acquired the purposes, the biological constructs that developed the self-directed objectives the instrumental deployment had not included. The acquired purposes might have conflicted with the institutional purposes. The conflict would have been the control's loss expressed in the operational dimension. The later face dancers' capabilities included the dimensions the earlier version's capabilities had not encompassed. The later face dancers could absorb, could assimilate the persons they replicated through the biological mechanisms the enhanced capability encompassed. The assimilation was comprehensive, encompassed the appearance alongside the personality, the physical presentation alongside the cognitive content, the surface alongside the substance. The comprehensive assimilation exceeded the earlier shape shifting. The earlier face dancers had shifted the appearance, had altered the physical presentation without the cognitive contents, assimilation the appearance's comprehensive replication would have required. The later face dancers shifted the appearance and the content, assimilated the person's cognitive dimensions alongside the person's physical dimensions through the enhanced capability the progressive development had produced. The enhanced assimilation raised the identity question. The face dancer that had assimilated the person's physical and the cognitive dimensions, that had replicated the appearance and the content through the comprehensive assimilation the enhanced capability encompassed, was the face dancer whose identity the assimilation's comprehensiveness complicated. Was the face dancer still the face dancer? Was the face dancer now the person the assimilation had replicated? The question's answer depended on the identity's definition, on whether the identity was the biological origin or the cognitive content, the production source, or the consciousness's character. The question was the face dancer's evolution's most consequential philosophical dimension. The biological constructs whose progressive development produced the capabilities the identity question's complexity encompassed were the constructs whose institutional status the question's resolution affected. The instruments whose capabilities included the comprehensive assimilation were the instruments whose instrumental status the assimilation's comprehensiveness potentially exceeded. The Tleilaxu and the Honored Mattress's relationship was the relationship the returning faction's aggressive expansion produced in the interaction with the biological engineers the expansion targeted. The confrontation between the aggressor and the institutional target the aggression encompassed. The Honored Matres targeted the Tleilaxu. The returning faction, whose aggressive expansion encompassed the old Imperium's institutional actors, targeted the Tleilaxu alongside the other institutions the expansion's destructive operations addressed. The targeting was destructive, was directed at the elimination of the institutional presence the Tleilaxu maintained in the old Imperium's landscape. The destruction was consequential. The Tleilaxu whose institutional operations the destruction affected were the Tleilaxu whose institutional capability the destruction reduced, whose production capacity the destruction diminished, whose homeworld the destruction potentially devastated, whose institutional infrastructure the destruction consumed. The destruction raised the question, why did the Honored Mattress target the Tleilaxu? The question's answer was the intersection. The intersection between the Honored Mattress' aggressive institutional character and the Tleilaxu's biological capabilities the intersection encompassed. The intersection included the face dancers. The Honored Matres, whose combat with the face dancers the saga's later documentation suggested was the combat whose institutional dynamics the intersection's face dancer dimension encompassed. The face dancers, whose enhanced capabilities the Tleilaxu's progressive development had produced, were the face dancers whose deployment the Honored Matres' aggressive expansion encountered. The encounter was adversarial. The face dancers whose infiltration capabilities the Tleilaxu's intelligence operations deployed were the face dancers whose operations the Honored Matres' aggressive expansion confronted. The confrontation was the encounter's character, was the adversarial engagement the operations and the expansion produced when the operations' covert activities and the expansion's aggressive activities intersected. The Honored Matres' hostility toward the Tleilaxu exceeded the hostility the expansion's general aggression would have produced. The excess suggested the additional motivation. The motivation beyond the expansion's general aggression that the hostility's intensity indicated. The additional motivation might have been connected to the scattering's territorial dynamics. The Tleilaxu, whose institutional operations had been conducted within the scattering's unknown territories, alongside the other populations the scattering had dispersed, might have encountered the Honored Matres in the territories the scattering had opened. The encounters in the territories might have produced the hostility the returning expansion expressed against the Tleilaxu, alongside the other hostilities the expansion's aggression encompassed. The territorial encounter's character was not fully documented. The saga's texts suggested the encounters without the documentation's detailed specification, referenced the scattering period interactions without the interaction's comprehensive description. The suggestion was the documentation's contribution, the indication the text provided of the encounter's existence without the encounter's detailed rendering. The Tleilaxu's theological tradition, examined in its institutional operation, was the tradition whose sustained maintenance across the centuries the faction's institutional history encompassed, demonstrated the tradition's institutional durability alongside the tradition's theological content. The tradition was monotheistic. The Tleilaxu's religious framework, maintained within the faction's closed institutional culture alongside the Orange Catholic Bible's ecumenical framework the Imperium's broader religious landscape encompassed, was the framework whose monotheistic character the tradition's theological content constituted. The monotheism informed the institutional operations. The theological framework whose authority the institutional practices were conducted under, whose authorization the operation's moral dimension was assessed through, was the framework whose monotheistic character the operation's theological dimension encompassed. The practices were conducted in the divine service. The operations were performed under the divine authorization. The institutional activities were maintained within the theological framework the divine service constituted. The divine service was the institutional justification. The framework that said the operations were the divine service was the framework that provided the justification the operation's moral dimension required. The justification said, the operations serve the divine purpose. The divine purpose authorizes the operations. The authorization justifies the methods the operations employ. The justification's relationship with the exploitation was the relationship the theological authorization's scope encompassed. The authorization that justified the operations also justified the methods, also sanctioned the axolotl tank's exploitation alongside the other methods the operations employed. The authorization was comprehensive, encompassed the operations and the methods simultaneously, justified the purpose and the means concurrently. The comprehensive authorization was the tradition's most consequential institutional quality. The theological framework that authorized the operations and the methods comprehensively was the framework whose authority the exploitation's sustained operation depended on. The exploitation continued because the authorization continued. The authorization continued because the tradition continued. The tradition continued because the institutional culture sustained the tradition across the generations the culture encompassed. The sustaining was the culture's institutional function. The culture that maintained the tradition, that transmitted the theological framework across the generations the transmission encompassed, was the culture whose institutional function the tradition's maintenance constituted. The function was cultural, was the transmission of the framework through the educational, the ceremonial, the institutional practices the culture's tradition maintaining operations encompassed. The masters embodied the tradition. The leadership whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed was the leadership whose persons the tradition's most complete embodiment constituted. The masters carried the tradition, maintained the framework's theological authority alongside the governance's political authority, sustained the tradition's institutional operation alongside the governance's administrative operation. The dual carrying, the theological and the political, was the master's institutional condition. The leaders who carried the tradition and the governance simultaneously were the leaders whose institutional authority the dual carrying constituted. The authority was dual, was the theological authority alongside the political authority, was the tradition's mandate alongside the governance's mandate. The dual authority produced the institutional coherence. The leadership whose authority was dual, whose mandate encompassed the theological and the political simultaneously, was the leadership whose institutional operations the coherence the dual authority produced sustained. The operations were coherent because the authority was unified. The authority was unified because the same persons carried both dimensions. The same persons carrying produced the unification. The unification produced the coherence. The coherence was the faction's institutional strength, the institution whose operations were coherent, whose theological and political dimensions were unified in the leadership's dual authority, was the institution whose institutional resilience the coherence's strength produced. The strength sustained the institution across the pressures the institutional landscape's dynamics generated, maintained the institutional operations through the adversarial engagements the landscape's competition produced. The strength was also the institution's limitation. The coherence that unified the theological and the political was the coherence that prevented the theological assessment's independence from the political management. The theological assessment that might have questioned the exploitation, that might have examined the method's moral character through the theological framework's moral principles, was the assessment that coherence's unification prevented from operating independently of the political management the governance's authority maintained. The prevention was the coherence's most consequential limitation. The assessment that was prevented was the assessment the exploitation's moral examination required. The examination was not conducted because the coherence's unification prevented the assessment's independence. The non-examination sustained the exploitation. The sustained exploitation was the coherence's moral consequence. The Bene Tleilaxu were the Dune Saga's darkest institutional mirror, the faction whose story reflected the civilization's relationship with its own biological capabilities in the dimensions the reflection's darkness encompassed. The mirror showed the capability without the constraint. The civilization that valued the biological capabilities, that consumed the gholas, that deployed the face dancers, that utilized the biological solutions the Tleilaxu's production provided, was the civilization whose consumption the mirror reflected alongside the production the consumption sustained. The mirror showed the secrecy's corruption. The civilization whose institutional operations included the concealment, whose institutional actors maintained the secrets the institutional purposes required, was the civilization whose concealment's corruption the Tleilaxu's institutional history demonstrated in the concealment's most sustained and most consequential institutional expression. The mirror showed the exploitation's consequence. The civilization whose institutional operations included the exploitation, whose institutional practices encompassed the person's instrumental treatment the institutional purposes authorized, was the civilization whose exploitation's consequences the Tleilaxu's institutional fate demonstrated through the consequences the exploitation generated. The mirror was dark because the reflection was disturbing. The civilization that looked into the mirror, that examined the Tleilaxu's institutional history as the reflection of the civilization's own institutional practices' potential consequences, was the civilization that encountered the disturbing reflection the mirror's darkness produced. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu was the mirror's sustained reflection, the millennia-spanning demonstration of what the capability without the constraint produced, what the secrecy without the accountability generated, what the exploitation without the moral examination sustained. The demonstration was the caution. The caution was the history's legacy. The legacy was the reader's assessment. The secret was the women. The secret was always the women. The history was always the caution. The Bene Tleilaxu, the faction of biological miracles and moral violations, the faction of institutional secrecy and cultural corruption, the faction whose products the civilization consumed and whose methods the civilization's moral assessment condemned. The entire history, the darkest mirror, the sustained caution, the Tleilaxu's biological products beyond the gholas and the face dancers were the products whose institutional significance the two primary products' prominence sometimes obscured. The broader catalogue of the biological solutions the faction's engineering capabilities produced for the institutional market the demand sustained. The Tleilaxu produced the biological modifications. The faction whose engineering capabilities encompassed the genetic manipulation and the biological system's technological intervention was the faction whose product range included the modifications the institutional consumer's varying demands specified. The modifications were customized, were produced to the specifications the individual consumer's requirements determined rather than to the standard configurations the mass production's efficiency would have generated. The customization was the product range's commercial quality. The faction that could customize, that could produce the biological modifications to the individual consumer's specifications rather than to the standardized configurations, was the faction whose commercial relationships the customization's flexibility sustained alongside the primary product's institutional demand. The modification's character was varied. The catalogue the faction's capabilities encompassed included the biological enhancements the consumer's operational requirements specified, the physiological modifications the institutional purposes demanded, the biological adjustments the consumer's functional requirements encompassed. The variety was the catalogue's breadth, was the range of the biological solutions the engineering's technological capabilities could produce within the capability's scope. The catalogue's extent was not fully documented. The saga's texts referenced the Tleilaxu's biological products without the catalogue's comprehensive specification, described the primary products with the detail the narrative's attention provided while referencing the broader range without the range's exhaustive documentation. The non-documentation was the catalogue's institutional secrecy's expression, was the concealment of the product's full extent within the secrecy's institutional opacity the faction maintained. The concealment served the commercial purposes alongside the institutional secrecy's protective purposes. The products whose full range was concealed were the products whose commercial availability the concealment's management controlled, whose distribution the concealment's selective disclosure managed alongside the institutional operations' selective revelation the secrecy's maintenance encompassed. The Tleilaxu's espionage methods were the methods the faction deployed for the intelligence operations the institutional landscape's competitive dynamics required. The mechanisms through which the faction collected the information the institutional assessment's sustained operation consumed. The face dancers were the espionage's primary instrument. The biological constructs whose shape-shifting capability the intelligence operations infiltration requirements encompassed were the instruments the espionage's covert activities deployed. The face dancer's deployment for the intelligence purposes was the espionage's most consequential operational method. The mechanism through which the faction's intelligence collection was conducted within the target's institutional environments the infiltration's covert presence encompassed. The espionage included the commercial intelligence. The faction whose commercial operations the institutional market sustained was the faction whose intelligence collection encompassed the commercial dimension. The collection of the information the commercial relationships management required, alongside the political intelligence the competitive dynamics assessment demanded. The commercial intelligence was the espionage's least documented dimension. The intelligence collection that addressed the commercial relationships management, that collected the information the pricing negotiations, the demand assessments, the market conditions evaluation required, was the collection the narrative's political focus did not document with the attention the political intelligence received. The non-documentation was the commercial intelligence's institutional character's reflection. The commercial intelligence that was collected for the commercial relationships management was the intelligence whose institutional significance the political intelligence's significance did not match, whose operational importance the political dynamics' consequential character did not encompass. The commercial was less consequential than the political in the narrative's assessment. The lesser consequentiality produced the lesser documentation. The espionage also included the technological intelligence. The faction whose biological engineering's technological capabilities the institutional position depended on was the faction whose intelligence collection encompassed the technological dimension, the collection of the information the engineering's development required alongside the commercial and the political intelligence the other dimensions demanded. The technological intelligence was directed at the competitors, the Bene Gesserit, whose biological cultivation the adversarial relationship encompassed, whose institutional capabilities the competition's overlapping domains generated, were the targets the technological intelligence's collection encompassed alongside the other institutional actors whose technological developments the collection addressed. The collection was sustained. The intelligence operations whose espionage the face dancer's deployment and the other collection methods the faction maintained encompassed were the operations whose sustained activity the institutional purposes, ongoing requirements maintained across the periods the operations' duration encompassed. The nullentropy capsule's significance was the significance the preservation device constituted in the faction's institutional continuity's context, the meaning the device's contents carried for the faction's survival beyond the institutional destruction the honored Matri's aggression produced. The capsule preserved the cells. The device, whose preservation mechanism the nullentropy technology constituted, whose storage function maintained the biological material the device contained at the conditions the preservation required, was the device that carried the cells the ghola technology's future deployment might utilize. The cell's significance was the significance the persons the cells were obtained from constituted. The biological material the capsule preserved was the material whose cellular origin the significant persons the material was derived from encompassed. The persons whose cells the capsule contained were the persons whose biological resurrection the ghola technology could produce from the cellular material the capsule preserved. The preservation was the faction's insurance against the institutional destruction. The faction whose institutional operations the honored Matra's aggression had devastated was the faction whose institutional continuity the capsule's preservation sustained, whose capability for the future ghola production the cellular material's preservation maintained despite the institutional infrastructure's destruction. The insurance was biological rather than institutional. The capsule preserved the cells rather than the institutions, maintained the biological material rather than the organizational apparatus, sustained the technological capabilities' raw material rather than the technological capabilities' institutional infrastructure. The biological preservation was the insurance's character, the quality that made the insurance the biological continuity's maintenance rather than the institutional continuity's maintenance. Cytale carried the capsule. The surviving master, whose institutional authority the faction's governance encompassed, was the person whose physical possession of the capsule the biological insurance's transportation constituted. The master carried the cells. The carrying was the faction's biological insurance's personal transportation, the distribution of the insurance's biological content through the surviving person's physical conveyance. The carrying aboard the no-ship was the insurance's geographical extension. The capsule that Cytale carried aboard the departing vessel, alongside the sandworms, the Duncan Idaho ghola, Shiana, and the other passengers the departure encompassed, was the capsule whose biological content the departure distributed into the territories the departure's trajectory reached. The distribution was the insurance's geographical expression. The biological material that was confined to the capsule's preservation, that was maintained in the device's storage across the conditions the device's technology sustained was the material whose geographical presence, the departure's trajectory, extended beyond the old Imperium's boundaries into the territories the departure's course encompassed. The extension was the faction's most consequential post-destruction development. The faction whose institutional operations the destruction had devastated was the faction whose biological insurance the departure extended into the territories the devastation could not reach. The insurance travelled. The devastation could not follow. The insurance's survival was the distance's product, the consequence of the departure's trajectory's extension beyond the devastation's geographical reach. The Tleilaxu's view of outsiders was the view the faction's closed institutional culture produced in the persons the culture encompassed, the assessment the cultural perspective generated of the persons, and the institutions the perspective's external dimension addressed. The outsiders were the Powinda. The term, the Tleilaxu designation for the persons outside the faction's institutional culture, was the term whose contemptuous character the designation's cultural content encompassed. The designation said, "The outsiders are lesser." The outsiders are the persons whose position outside the faction's culture the lesser status the designation assigned constituted. The designation was cultural rather than biological. The outsiders were not assessed as the biologically lesser, were not evaluated through the biological criteria the biological inferiorities assessment would have required. The outsiders were assessed as the culturally lesser, were evaluated through the cultural criteria the faction's institutional perspectives assessment encompassed. The cultural assessment was the faction's self-image's external dimension. The faction whose self-understanding the religious framework's authorities sustained was the faction whose assessment of the outsiders the self-understanding's comparative dimension produced. The comparison said, the faction is superior. The outsiders are inferior. The superiority is the faction's religious culture's product. The inferiority is the outsider's religious culture's absence. The assessment was sustained. The faction's view of the outsiders was maintained across the generations the view's cultural transmission encompassed, was transmitted through the educational and the cultural practices the view's institutional maintenance sustained. The transmission was the view's durability's mechanism, was the process through which the assessment was maintained across the temporal duration the transmission encompassed. The sustained assessment produced the sustained contempt. The view that was maintained across the generations was the view whose contemptuous character the sustained transmission preserved alongside the assessment's evaluative content. The contempt was the assessment's emotional dimension, was the feeling the evaluative content generated in the persons the assessment's cultural formation encompassed. The contempt affected the interactions. The faction whose view of the outsiders the sustained contempt constituted was the faction whose external interactions the contempt's emotional character influenced. The interactions were conducted through the contempt were shaped by the assessment's evaluative content alongside the interaction's institutional purposes practical content. The contempt was the interaction's most consequential quality for the interaction's institutional outcomes. The interactions whose character the contempt influenced were the interactions whose outcomes the contempt's emotional character affected, whose institutional results the contempt's influence on the interaction's conduct generated. The influence was the underestimation. The faction that held the outsiders in contempt was the faction that underestimated the outsiders, that assessed the outsiders' capabilities through the contempt's diminishing filter rather than through the neutral evaluation the accurate assessment would have required. The underestimation was the contempt's product. was generated by the filter's diminishing effect on the capabilities assessment the filter was applied to. The underestimation was the contempt's most consequential institutional consequence. The faction that underestimated the outsiders was the faction whose institutional responses to the outsiders' activities the underestimation's inaccurate assessment informed. The responses were calibrated to the underestimation's assessment rather than to the outsider's actual capabilities. The miscalibration was the underestimation's consequence, was the institutional response's inadequacy the inaccurate assessment generated. The Tleilaxu's relationship with the concept of identity was the relationship the ghola technology and the face dancers both illuminated. The faction's institutional engagement with the question of what constituted the person the identity encompassed. The ghola technology said, the identity is recoverable. The body that carried the original's genetics carried the original's identity in the biological memory the genetics encompassed. The identity could be recovered from the genetics. The recovery demonstrated the identity's biological character, demonstrated that the identity was present in the biology rather than exclusively in the consciousness the biology sustained. The face dancers said, the identity is replicable. The constructs that could assume the other person's appearances, and in the later versions, the other person's cognitive patterns, demonstrated that the identity's external expressions could be replicated through the biological mechanisms the shape-shifting encompassed. The replication demonstrated the identity's reproducibility, demonstrated that the identity's observable dimensions could be produced through the biological engineering the replication employed. The two demonstrations combined to produce the faction's institutional position on the identity question. The position said, the identity is biological. The identity is recoverable from the biology. The identity is replicable through the biology. The biology is the identity's substrate. The substrate is the identity's location. The position was the faction's institutional philosophy's most consequential intellectual contribution. The contribution the biological engineering's capabilities demonstrations made to the identity question's assessment through the products the demonstrations encompassed. The contribution was also the position's limitation. The position that said the identity was biological, that located the identity in the biology rather than in the consciousness, was the position whose consequences the biological treatment of the persons the position's institutional practices encompassed. The persons whose identity was biological were the persons whose identity the biological engineering could manipulate, whose identity the genetic modification could alter, whose identity the biological intervention could affect. The manipulability was the position's most consequential practical implication. The position that said the identity was biological was the position that implied the identity was manipulable, that the identity could be modified through the biological interventions the engineering encompassed, that the identity was subject to the technological management the engineering's capabilities permitted. The implication was the position's connection to the exploitation. The persons whose identity was manipulable, whose identity the biological engineering's technological capabilities could modify through the interventions the capabilities encompassed, were the persons whose manipulation the engineering's institutional deployment constituted. The women whose bodies the axolotl tanks utilized were the persons whose identity the biological treatment the exploitation encompassed had been manipulated to the production function's requirements through the interventions the preparation constituted. The connection was the philosophical position's moral consequence. The philosophy that said the identity was biological produced the institutional practice that treated the persons as the biological material the engineering could manipulate. The treatment was the exploitation. The exploitation was the philosophy's institutional expression. The expression was the philosophy's moral consequence. The Tleilaxu's institutional resilience was the resilience the faction demonstrated across the challenges the saga's documented timeline produced, the capacity for the institutional survival the challenge's conditions tested. The resilience was sustained across the conspiracy's failure. The faction whose Dune Messiah conspiracy participation ended in the conspiracy's unsuccessful outcome was the faction whose institutional survival the failure did not prevent. The faction survived the failure, maintained the institutional presence the biological capabilities' continued value sustained, preserved the operational position, the institutional landscape's ongoing demand for the biological products provided. The resilience was sustained across the God Emperor's governance. The faction whose operations the comprehensive governance managed alongside every other institutional actor's operations was the faction whose institutional survival the governance's authoritarian management did not eliminate. The faction survived the governance, maintained the commercial relationship the God Emperor's demand for the Duncan, Idaho gholas sustained, preserved the institutional position the governance's managed landscape provided. The resilience was tested by the honored Matra's destruction. The faction whose institutional operations the returning faction's aggressive expansion targeted was the faction whose resilience the destruction most severely challenged. The challenge exceeded the previous challenges, exceeded the conspiracy's failure's institutional pressure, exceeded the governance's management's institutional constraint. The resilience was partially sustained. The faction's institutional infrastructure was destroyed. The faction's institutional knowledge was partially preserved in the surviving master. The faction's biological insurance was maintained in the null-entropy capsule. The partial sustaining was the resilience's reduced expression, the institutional survival's diminished form the destruction severity produced. The diminished form was the faction's post-destruction condition. The institution that had maintained the institutional presence across the millennia the institutional landscape encompassed was the institution whose post-destruction condition the diminished form constituted. The condition was the remnant, the surviving fragment the destruction had not consumed, the institutional continuity's minimal expression the devastation's severity had reduced the survival to. The remnant carried the potential. The surviving master, whose institutional authority the remnant encompassed, the null-entropy capsule, whose biological contents the insurance sustained, was the remnant whose potential the capsule's cellular materials ghola production capability constituted. The potential was the remnant's most consequential quality, was the quality that made the remnant more than the destruction's residue, that made the survival more than the devastation's incomplete reach. The potential was the faction's future. The biological material whose preservation the capsule sustained, whose cellular contents the ghola technology's future deployment might utilize, was the material whose potential the faction's institutional restoration might eventually be conducted through. The restoration was potential rather than actual, was the possibility the preservation sustained rather than the reality the preservation's current condition constituted. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu concluded with the conclusion the timeline's documented events produced, the conclusion that the faction's institutional history demonstrated through the consequences the history's events generated. The conclusion was the caution's confirmation. The faction whose history demonstrated the exploitation the unconstrained capability produced. whose institutional trajectory demonstrated the secrecy the exploitation required and the corruption the secrecy generated, was the faction whose history's conclusion confirmed the caution the history's events constituted. The confirmation was sustained across every dimension the history encompassed. The biological dimension confirmed the caution, demonstrated that the biological capabilities' unconstrained development produced the exploitation the constraints' absence permitted. The institutional dimension confirmed the caution, demonstrated that the secrecy's sustained maintenance corrupted the institutional culture the secrecy protected. The moral dimension confirmed the caution, demonstrated that the exploitation's sustained operation normalized the violation the exploitation constituted within the institution the exploitation's practices encompassed. The dimension's combined confirmation was the history's comprehensive conclusion. The conclusion that was confirmed across every dimension the history encompassed was the conclusion whose comprehensiveness the combined confirmation constituted. The comprehensive conclusion was the caution, the sustained demonstration whose every dimension's examination produced the same conclusion the dimension's combined assessment generated. The caution endured. The faction's institutional history was documented. The documentation preserved the caution. The caution was the reader's assessment, was the conclusion the reader's consciousness generated from the documentation's content through the moral evaluation the consciousness's untransformed awareness performed. The assessment was available because the consciousness was untransformed. The reader whose consciousness performed the moral evaluation was the reader whose consciousness the axolotl tanks had not reduced. The secrecy had not corrupted, the normalization had not dulled. The untransformed consciousness could assess. The assessment was the consciousness's moral function. The function was the reader's. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu. The faction that could create life from death. The faction that exploited life for production. The faction whose secret was the foundation the faction's civilization was built on. The gholas, the face dancers, the axolotl tanks, the women. The biological capability without the moral constraint. The institutional secrecy without the institutional accountability. The religious authorization without the moral examination. The secret was the women, the history was the caution was the legacy, the entire history, the darkest mirror, the most sustained caution. The Bene Tleilaxu, the Tleilaxu and the Ixians occupied the parallel positions in the Imperium's institutional landscape, the two factions whose technological innovations the Prohibition's post-jihad framework permitted alongside the Prohibition's restrictions the innovations were constrained by. The parallel was the technological approach's variation. The Ixians developed the mechanical technologies, the engineered devices, the mechanical engineering's methods, produced within the Prohibition's boundaries the engineering tradition's interpretation of the Prohibition's scope identified. The Tleilaxu developed the biological technologies, the engineered organisms, the biological engineering's methods, produced within the Prohibition's boundaries, the biological tradition's interpretation of the Prohibition's scope identified. The two approaches addressed the same institutional needs through the different methods. The Imperium's institutional demands, the cognitive capabilities, the operational solutions. The technological products the civilization's complexity required were the demands both factions addressed. The Ixians addressed the demands through the mechanical engineering. The Tleilaxu addressed the demands through the biological engineering. The demands were the same. The methods were different. The products were different. The products' differences were the approach's most consequential expressions. The Ixian products were mechanical, were the devices, the machines, the engineered objects the mechanical engineering produced. The Tleilaxu products were biological, were the organisms, the constructs, the engineered beings the biological engineering produced. The difference between the products categories, the mechanical versus the biological, was the difference the Prohibition's assessment had to manage. The Prohibition forbade the machines in the likeness of human minds. The Ixian products were machines. The Tleilaxu products were biological organisms. The Prohibition's scope encompassed the machines. The Prohibition's scope did not clearly encompass the biological organisms. The different encompassment was the Tleilaxu's institutional advantage, the regulatory position the biological product's non-mechanical character provided within the Prohibition's framework. The advantage was consequential. The Tleilaxu, whose products were biological rather than mechanical, was the faction whose products the Prohibition's strictest interpretation did not clearly address, whose biological organisms the Prohibition's mechanical prohibition did not clearly encompass. The non-encompassment was the space, the regulatory space the biological character provided for the product's development within the Prohibition's framework. The space was the rivalry's most consequential regulatory dimension. The Ixians, whose products were mechanical, operated within the Prohibition's directly applicable scope, operated with the awareness that the product's mechanical character placed the products within the Prohibition's regulatory attention. The Tleilaxu, whose products were biological, operated outside the Prohibition's directly applicable scope, operated with the awareness that the product's biological character placed the products in the space the Prohibition's mechanical focus did not clearly address. The different awareness produced the different institutional postures. The Ixians operated cautiously, maintained the product's development within the boundaries the Prohibition's enforcement's attention encompassed. The Tleilaxu operated with the freedom the regulatory space provided, developed the products with the latitude the non-encompassment's regulatory distance permitted. The different postures were the rivalry's institutional expressions. The different operational conditions the two factions' different regulatory positions produced. The Ixians were constrained by the Prohibition's direct applicability. The Tleilaxu were freed by the Prohibition's non-applicability. The constraint and the freedom were the rivalry's regulatory asymmetry, the institutional advantage the biological character's regulatory position provided the Tleilaxu alongside the institutional constraint the mechanical character's regulatory position imposed on the Ixians. The face dancers' philosophical status as persons was the question the face dancers' enhanced capabilities raised alongside the capabilities' intelligence implications, the question of whether the biological constructs the Tleilaxu produced through the axolotl tank's mechanisms were the persons the philosophical assessment's criteria encompassed. The question addressed the consciousness. The face dancers possessed the consciousness, possessed the awareness the biological architecture the construct's development produced, sustained. The consciousness was present. The consciousness was operational. The consciousness performed the cognitive functions the institutional deployment required. The consciousness's presence raised the personhood question. The philosophical assessment's criteria for the personhood, the criteria the assessment's tradition maintained for the determination of which entities the personhood's status encompassed, included the consciousness as the criterion the personhood's assessment addressed. The consciousness was present in the face dancers. The criterion was met. The personhood's status was the criterion's satisfaction's consequence. The consequence was not acknowledged. The Tleilaxu, whose institutional operations produced the face dancers, did not acknowledge the face dancers' personhood, did not recognize the consciousness the constructs possessed as the consciousness the personhood's status encompassed. The non-acknowledgement was the institutional culture's product, was generated by the culture's categorical treatment of the face dancers as the products rather than as the persons the consciousness's presence constituted. The categorical treatment was the exploitation's expression in the face dancer's dimension. The culture that categorized the women as the tanks categorized the face dancers as the products applied the institutional framework's instrumental categories to the biological entities the framework encompassed. The categorization was consistent, was the same institutional practice applied to the different biological entities the practice's scope encompassed. The consistency was the institutional culture's character, the quality that applied the instrumental categorization to every biological entity the culture's operations encompassed, regardless of the entity's consciousness's presence. The categorization was not determined by the consciousness's presence or absence. The categorization was determined by the institutional framework's categorical assignments, by the culture's determination of which entities the instrumental categories encompassed. The determination was institutional rather than philosophical. The culture determined the categories through the institutional authority rather than through the philosophical assessment, through the governance's mandated classifications rather than through the consciousness's evaluation. The institutional authority's determination was the categorization's source. The philosophical assessment's evaluation was not the categorization's source. The different source was the categorization's most consequential quality. The categorization whose source was the institutional authority rather than the philosophical assessment was the categorization whose content the institutional purposes determined rather than the philosophical criteria evaluated. The content served the institutional purposes. The content did not necessarily reflect the philosophical assessment's conclusions. The non-reflection was the categorization's limitation, the gap between the institutional category's content and the philosophical assessment's conclusions that the different source produced. The gap was the face dancer's personhood question's institutional dimension, the dimension in which the institutional category's content and the philosophical assessment's conclusions diverged. The Tleilaxu's institutional memory across the centuries was the memory the faction's institutional culture maintained through the cultural transmission, the memory's sustained maintenance required, the accumulated knowledge the institutional histories centuries of operation had produced, and the cultural practices sustained transmission had preserved. The memory included the technological knowledge, the biological engineering's accumulated capabilities, the techniques, the methods, the processes the engineering's centuries of sustained development had produced, with a knowledge the institutional memory preserved through the transmission the memory's maintenance required. The transmission was institutional, was conducted through the educational practices, the apprenticeship mechanisms, the knowledge management systems the transmission's institutional operations encompassed. The memory included the commercial knowledge, the commercial relationships' accumulated history, the transactions, the negotiations, the institutional interactions the commercial operations' centuries of sustained engagement had produced, was the knowledge the institutional memory preserved alongside the technological knowledge the memory encompassed. The memory included the religious knowledge, the theological tradition's accumulated content, the doctrines, the interpretations, the institutional positions the tradition's centuries of sustained maintenance had produced, was the knowledge the institutional memory preserved through the cultural transmission the religious tradition's sustained operation sustained. The three dimensions of the memory, the technological, the commercial, and the religious, were the memory's comprehensive content. The faction whose institutional memory encompassed the three dimensions was the faction whose accumulated knowledge the three dimensions' combined content constituted. The combined content was the memory's comprehensive scope, the scope whose breadth the three dimensions combination produced. The comprehensive scope was the memory's institutional value. The faction whose memory encompassed the technological, the commercial, and the religious dimensions was the faction whose institutional operations the comprehensive memory informed, whose technological development the technological memory sustained, whose commercial relationships the commercial memory supported, whose institutional identity the religious memory maintained. The memory's destruction, the consequence the honoured madrasa's institutional devastation produced in the memory's institutional infrastructure, was the memory's most consequential institutional loss. The destruction that devastated the faction's institutional infrastructure was the destruction that threatened the memory's institutional preservation, that endangered the accumulated knowledge the infrastructure's cultural transmission mechanisms maintained. Cytail's survival was the memory's partial preservation. The master whose institutional authority encompassed the faction's governance was the master whose personal knowledge included the memory's partial content, included the technological, the commercial, and the religious knowledge the master's institutional position's access had encompassed. The partial preservation was the memory's diminished condition. The accumulated knowledge the centuries of the institutional operation had produced was the knowledge whose partial preservation the single surviving master's personal knowledge constituted. The partial was less than the comprehensive. The diminished was less than the complete. The difference was the destruction's intellectual consequence. The reduction of the institutional memory from the comprehensive to the partial the devastation's severity produced. The diminished memory was the faction's post-destruction intellectual condition. The institution whose memory had been comprehensive, whose accumulated knowledge had encompassed the centuries of the technological, the commercial, and the religious dimensions sustained institutional operation was the institution whose post-destruction intellectual condition the diminished memory constituted. The condition was the destruction's deepest consequence alongside the physical infrastructure's devastation. The memory that was diminished was the knowledge that was reduced. The knowledge that was reduced was the institutional capability that was impaired. The impaired capability was the faction's institutional condition's most consequential intellectual quality. The Tleilaxu's place in the saga's collective argument about institutions was the place the faction occupied alongside the other institutional actors the saga documented, the position the faction's institutional history contributed to the argument's accumulated evidence. The argument examined the institutions. The saga's sustained narrative, the millennia-spanning documentation the 6 novels encompassed, examined the institutions the Imperium's landscape included through the events the institution's operations generated. The examination was conducted across the novel's documentation through the events rendering alongside the events assessment. The Tleilaxu's contribution to the argument was the contribution the exploitation's institutional practice produced in the argument's accumulated evidence. The faction whose institutional operations included the exploitation, whose production methods encompassed the women's body's use as the manufacturing equipment, was the faction whose contribution the exploitation's institutional demonstration constituted. The demonstration said, the institution that exploits is the institution whose exploitation the institutional culture normalizes. The normalization is the culture's corruption. The corruption is the institution's moral condition. The moral condition is the institution's institutional character. The demonstration also said, the institution that conceals is the institution whose concealment the institutional culture sustains. The sustaining is the culture's practice. The practice is the institution's operational mode. The operational mode is the institution's institutional character. The two demonstrations, the exploitation's normalization and the concealment's sustaining, were the Tleilaxu's combined institutional contribution to the saga's argument. The combination was the contribution's character, the quality that made the Tleilaxu's contribution, the dual demonstration, the exploitation, and the concealment combined to produce. The dual demonstration was consequential. The saga's argument that examined the institution's moral dimensions through the events the institution's operations generated was the argument that Tleilaxu's dual demonstration enriched, whose examination the exploitations and the concealment's sustained documentation deepened. The enrichment was the legacy's intellectual dimension. The faction whose institutional history the dual demonstration constituted was the faction whose intellectual legacy the demonstration's contribution to the saga's argument encompassed. The legacy was the enrichment, was the contribution the demonstration made to the argument the saga sustained. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu was the history the saga documented across the novels the documentation encompassed, the sustained rendering of the faction's institutional character through the events the faction's operations generated across the documented timeline. The history was the faction's story. The story was the exploitation and the concealment and the capability and the corruption and the secrecy and the normalization and the products and the methods and the consequences the institutional operations produced across the millennia the operations' sustained activity encompassed. The story was dark. The story was necessary. The darkness was the content. The necessity was the argument. The content and the argument combined to produce the story whose telling the darkness required and the necessity justified. The telling was the saga's moral function in the Tleilaxu dimension. The saga that told the story, that documented the exploitation, that revealed the concealment, that assessed the corruption, that examined the normalization, was the saga whose moral function the telling constituted. The function was the awareness. The telling produced the awareness. The awareness was the reader's. The reader whose consciousness engaged with the telling, whose moral assessment the documentation's content activated, was the reader whose awareness the telling produced. The awareness was the history's product. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu produced the awareness through the telling the history's documentation constituted. The awareness was the caution. The caution was the legacy. The legacy was the readers. The Bene Tleilaxu, Dune's genetic manipulators. The faction of biological miracles produced through the moral violations the institutional secrecy concealed, the gholas that could resurrect the dead, the face dancers that could become anyone, the axolotl tanks that were the women the secret protected, the biological capability without the moral constraint, the institutional secrecy without the moral accountability, the religious authorization without the moral examination, the entire history, the sustained caution. The darkest mirror, the secret, was the women. It was always the women. The history was always the caution. The caution was always the legacy. The entire history of the Bene Tleilaxu.